Perhaps the most well-known examples of geopolitical strife in Mediterranean history are the Peloponnesian Wars. Thucydides and other writers have documented the epic conflict between Athens, a rising power, and Sparta, an established hegemon. It has generated a lot of debate among political scientists, philosophers, and classicists. Since the prelude and aftermath of a fight of this magnitude are almost as extensive and intricate as the actual combat, it is nearly difficult to adequately explain it in all of its gritty elements. We shall talk about the war's numerous conflicts and the evolution of Hellas politics in our Peloponnesian War video. In order to make sure our tale is as accurate as possible, we will combine all of the episodes into a single, lengthy narrative in this movie. We will also add a few battles descriptions and adjustments. Welcome to our film, which covers the politics, conflicts, and events of the whole Peloponnesian Wars. Before the invasions, the ancient Greek world was significantly different from what it was after the Persian Empire was decisively beaten in the battles of Plataea and Mycale in April. In order to withstand the Persian invasion, the various city-states of the Hellenic mainland had adapted a variety of strategies, including fighting, running, and medizing, which meant surrender. Many city-states were grateful to the old hegemon Sparta for its courageous stance against Persia. Another emerging city-state, with a sizable and formidable fleet, was gaining ground in the meanwhile. This city-state was Athens, which had been a minor force in the Greek world with a lot of political unrest before to the Persian invasion. Despite their crucial contributions to the downfall of Persia, Athens and Sparta immediately clashed over what to do once the King of Kings was driven out. Being satisfied with its Peloponnesian zone of influence and historically conservative in its foreign policy, Sparta had no desire to engage in more combat. Encouraged by its recent successes, Athens wanted to expand the battle to Asia Minor and the Hellespont, claiming to be a liberator of the Hellenic city-states that were still ruled by the Persians. Consequently, Athens became the leader of the so-called Delian League of Cities, which was established in April on the island of Delos, which served as its name. This league was intended to carry on battling and freeing Greek cities with the money for its military expenses coming from a common treasury. The conflict was largely sparked by the growth of this coalition, its slow transformation into an Athenian empire, and the fear it instilled in Spartan elites. The Peloponnesian League, which was established in May under Spartan jurisdiction in reaction to the expanding Athenian dominance, served as a vehicle for the Peloponnesian nations to maintain their subordination to Sparta. Similar to NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the Cold War, these alliances established a precarious power balance, but throughout the conflict, many of their members would revolt and attempt to swap sides. One significant event in Thucydides' Prelude to War, which he referred to as archaeologia and Pentakontetsia, was the building of Athens' lengthy walls in April. This event alarmed Sparta, which views the creation of a more militant, fortified Athens with apprehension. To resolve their disputes, Themistocles, who gained notoriety for his role in the Battle of Salamis, was dispatched to Sparta as an ambassador. The lengthy walls eventually connected Athens' harbor Piraeus to the city itself, after Themistocles was able to postpone Spartan diplomatic attempts long enough for Athens to start building the walls. To make matters worse, the Helot uprising in Messenia was another instance in which Athens humiliated Sparta. The Spartan state slaves, known as helots, rose up in rebellion after becoming dissatisfied with their especially harsh treatment. The renowned warrior city-state of Sparta rebuffed Athens' offer to assist in putting an end to this uprising. Since Sparta was solely skilled in hoplite warfare, Athens was eventually permitted to assist with sieges. As they engaged in operations in Asia Minor, Ionia, and the Hellespont, Athens' military and political stature grew throughout the ensuing decades. Even in April, there were significant operations in Egypt, but they were mostly unsuccessful and cost the Delians a great deal of ground. In April, the Athenians won a battle in Cyprus, but Cimon, the Athenians' leader, was killed. Before long, the dynamic Athenian democracy, with its ever-shifting factions, had started to establish itself as the undisputed leader of its coalition. In April, the Delian League's treasure, which had been housed in the shrine of Delos, was relocated to Athens. To the chagrin of Athens's friends, these newly acquired funds, which were supposed to help all the League's cities equally, were utilized for public works projects in Athens. In fact, many allies refused to pay tribute when the Ionian city of Erethe rose against Athens in April of 50 BCE. Athens's power was unaffected nevertheless. This was partly because the money that was taken from Delos also helped the Athens build up its navy, up to the Peace of Callias, which traded Cyprus for an Asia Minor free from Persian rule. Athens kept exporting her naval might overseas. By establishing colonies like Thurii in Magna Graecia, a historically autonomous region of the Hellenic world under Syracusan control, Athens simultaneously continued to increase its power. It was also changing at home during Athens's expansion wars, thanks to a creative young politician named Pericles, who started a number of democratic reforms and actions against the affluent. In keeping with his successor's seaward orientation, he made investments to build a powerful fleet to further Athens' commercial interests. Aegina was one of the Peloponnesian states who battled Athens in April. However, Aegina was vanquished by the burgeoning naval force, which besieged and took control of the city. Because of its part in creating the alliances that led to the full-scale fight, Soviet history has actually referred to this as the First Peloponnesian War. The small Battle of Oino, fought in April, saw the Athenians and the Archimedes unite for a same cause and beat the Spartans. Then came the fight of Aegina, in which the Athenians vanquished 70 ships of Aegina and subdued it as a vassal. We shall concentrate on the Hellenic mainland, but this conflict occurred concurrently with Delian battles in Egypt, which put a great deal of strain on their resources. Although it is an unimportant fight in and of itself, the fight of Aegina laid the groundwork for the conflict. While Athens started working toward expanding its power in central Greece, the Spartans gathered their supporters. This is because the Attican Peninsula's vulnerability counterbalances Athens' maritime might. Due to territorial issues with Corinth, Megara asked for Athenian aid at the start of the war and temporarily joined its coalition. This explains why Tanagra and Onophete, two significant wars that took place in April of that year, happened nearly simultaneously. The rivalry between the Doric city-states and the Phocians led to the first combat. To subdue Phorcea, Sparta marched into the area with 10,000 allied soldiers and 1,500 hoplites. According to Thucydides, Athens retaliated by deploying its own army because they were equally concerned that Sparta would utilize internal forces to topple Athens' democracy. Because the Spartans were concerned about traveling over dangerous terrain, or the sea, which the Athenians controlled, Tanagra was selected as the battleground. The Athenians had a force of 11,000, including 1,500 Argivi friends. Although little is known about the conflict, the Spartans prevailed, drove Phocis out of the Dorian towns, and withdrew to the Peloponnese. After regrouping, Athens proceeded to Oenophitae 2 months later. After fighting and defeating the Boeotians, there they tore down Tanagra's fortifications and finished their own lengthy walls. Athens' resources were strained by the war in Egypt, though, and they eventually started to lose ground in Greece as well. As a result, Cimon mediated a short-term truce in April. In April, Athens negotiated the Peace of Callias with Persia by ceding Cyprus to Persia and securing Athenian dominion over coastal Asia Minor. This treaty permitted Athens to resume its operations on the mainland. Meanwhile, Sparta and Phocia were again at odds, this time over possession of Delphi, a place of pilgrimage. Sparta marched into Delphi, expelled the Phocians, and started the Second Sacred War. They replaced them with amiable Spartans to look over the temple. Pericles, who at the time was thinking about a limited foreign policy, could not let the Spartans to dominate such a revered oracle. In order to reinstate the Delphic caretakers, he marched back to Delphi and drove the Spartans out. The Battle of Chaeronea is the last battle of the conflict that we are aware of. According to Thucydides, some Boeotian anti-Athenian exiles attempted to return and retake land in an attempt to re-establish their dominance. Athens dispatched 1,000 hoplites under a certain Thalmudus in an attempt to ensure that its Boeotian gains were maintained. Chaeronea was successfully captured at first, but the Boeotians attacked the Athenians as they marched into the city, killing many Athenians, including Thalmudus. Thus, the pre-war situation was restored when the conflict came to a conclusion. Many other cities in the Delian League revolted, including Samos in April, fearing that Athens would soon become their master rather than their ally. A Samian-Meladian quarrel that had started a few years prior was the cause of the conflict. Following an unsuccessful attempt at mediation, Pericles sent 40 ships to Samos, toppled the oligarchy, and fined the city when Miletus appealed to Athens for assistance. Some Samoans rebelled and attempted to break free from the Athenian tyranny as soon as Athens left. This uprising posed a danger to Byzantium, Caria Chalcidiki, and Mytilene, another Ionian city that served as a regional center. Mytilene would be glad to revolt if the Spartans offered assistance, and the neighboring Persian satrap Pisathunas was also willing to support the uprising if it gained momentum. The uprising was put down when Athens dispatched 70 triremes into the area. Ultimately, the insurrection was doomed to failure since neither Persia nor the Peloponnesian League provided assistance. Following this, Athens emerged as the Delian League's undeniable hegemonic ruler. At first, Pericles avoided confrontation with Sparta by acting as a conservative and cautious foreign policy actor. Following the old Spartan tradition of restraint and introversion, Archidamus II, one of the two Spartan rulers, was similarly eager to avoid conflict. The 30 Years' Peace, which divided ancient Greece into areas of power between the two cities, was really signed in April. This was significant since the years between April and now are seen as a kind of Cold War between the two leagues, with Megara siding with Sparta and Argos with Athens. When Athens and Corinth the most potent secondary player in the Peloponnesian League, clashed over the development of commercial interests, the Cold War would finally boil up. Several political disputes with neighboring towns resulted from Corinth's status as a great maritime force with several colonies. Epidamnus was one such city where oligarchic and democratic factions clashed. The oligarchs were driven out to the nearby Illyrian tribes in a democratic coup that occurred in April. Corcyra, Epidamnus's mother colony, became aware of the ensuing battle, but at first took no action. Rather, the Epidamnian Democrats turned to the Corcyraeans, who were unpopular in Corinth, for support. The Athenians, therefore, launched a proxy war within Sparta's area of influence. Eventually, Corcyra and Corinth engaged in combat at the Battle of Sparta, which further heightened tensions. The larger combat between Corinth and Corcyra in April included the Battle of Sparta. Following a confrontation with the Corcyraeans, Corinth stationed their ships south of Corfu in April, then sailed home and started building an even bigger fleet. The Corcyraeans, who had no alliance, were frightened by this and dispatched envoys to Athens to seek help. In order to secure Athens as an ally, Corinth also dispatched envoys. Following extensive discussion, the Athenians agreed to support Corcyra and dispatched 10 ships to Corcyra with the explicit directive to refrain from attacking Corinthian vessels unless an invasion was imminent, establishing a strictly defensive alliance. Corcyra and its allies had 120 ships compared to 150 for Corinth and her allies. There were 120 ships in the Corcyra navy and its allies. Anchored in the tiny islet chain known as the Sabater Islands and Cape Leucami, which gives the conflict its name, the Corcyraean fleet was on the southern edge of Corfu. They positioned their ships in Camarium Corinth to the south. Corinth positioned their ships at dusk. At dusk, Corinth proceeded north and launched their fleet. Athens was on the right wing of the 3 squadrons that faced the Corcyraeans. The remaining allies were in the middle. Corinth's ships were on the left, and the Megarian and Ambracian friends were on the right. After facing one another, the 2 fleets engaged in combat. The ships were effectively boarding vessels, with a lot of hand-to-hand fighting as people stormed one another's ships due to the high number of hoplites and javelin throwers. At first, Athens was held in check and only assaulted when the Corcyraeans were in danger. This gradually altered when the Corcyraean right and Corinthian left faced off, with the latter losing the battle. Athens rolled in, but ultimately they were forced to land along with the Corcyraean. The Corcyraean and Athenians were terrified that the Corinthians would land on Corfu, so they went to gather their dead. They thus launched an attack and pushed back into the water. The Corinthians withdrew when the 20 ships of Athenian reinforcements arrived on schedule. After witnessing the opposing ships emerge for combat the following day, Corinth dispatched an ambassador to inquire as to whether Athens and Corinth were at war. Corinth was forced to retreat when Athens retorted that they were only present defensively. Both sides displayed victory trophies as a result of this strange impasse, a contentious issue that was supposedly resolved only the following year at the Sevalaki exhibition in Olympus. Athens exacerbated tensions by putting economic penalties on the city of Megara in April, while Corcyra and Corinth both declared victory following their standoff at Sparta. Pericles personally backed the so-called Megarian decree, which was intended as retaliation for the Megarians' alleged infringement on Demetra's holy fields. The truth was more political than religious. The Megarians were antagonistic toward Athens because they had supported Corinth. In a fit of rage, Sparta demanded that Athens renounce the order and release Aegina. Nevertheless, the Athenians remained unyielding and persisted in intimidating lesser cities within its coalition. Potidæa, a Corinthian colony with extensive connections to its home colony, including yearly visits by magistrates, was one such city. Potidæa was given an ultimatum by Athens to remove the walls of Corinth and stop all connection with it. Negotiations failed since Athens had already dispatched troops to execute the ultimatum, despite Potidæa sending diplomats to both Sparta and Athens. Immediately, the Chalcidice and Boeotian towns joined the Potidæan uprising and formed an alliance with them. Perdiccas, the ruler of Macedonia, assisted them by facilitating the movement of their army inland to Olynthus. The first battle between Athens and Perdiccas involved 30 ships and 1,000 hoplites commanded by General Archestratus, who expected the Ponteidanes to quickly comply with Athens' desires and raise their payment. In the meanwhile, Corinth dispatched 400 light troops and 100 to 600 hoplites to Potidæa under Aristeus' leadership, and Sparta and the Peloponnesian League had given Potidæa some unspoken assurances. In order to maintain the peace for 30 years, these volunteers were unofficial. Athens responded by increasing its contribution with 40 additional ships under Callias's command and an additional 2,000 hoplites. The united Athenian forces sailed to Potidæa and landed there with 400 cavalry after some combat with Perdiccas. In contrast, the Potidæan and Peloponnesian coalition had 600 hoplites, 200 light men, and 400 cavalry. Following his conquest of the Macedonian city of Thermi-Archestratus, launched an immediate siege of Pydna, which the Athenian troops joined as soon as they got there. Pericles had told Callias to concentrate on putting down potential uprisings rather than the Macedonian front, so he promptly negotiated a ceasefire with Perdiccas. This arrangement pleased the Athenians, who focused all of their troops on Potidæa. While their 70 ships cruised down the coast, the 3,000 Athenian hoplites, their allies, and 600 Macedonian cavalry marched out of Pydna and into Potidæa. Perdiccas, who had already violated his word and deserted the alliance with Athens, was picked to lead the cavalry, while Aristeus was chosen to lead the infantry. Their army was divided in two by the anti-Athenian allies. While the Chalcidians, Macedonians, and other allies took up arms close to Olynthus, the Corinthians and Potidæans took up their positions on the isthmus immediately to the north. They intended to lure the Athenians down the valley toward the isthmus, then climb up from Olynthus to encircle them in order to capture them. They were outmaneuvered by the Athenians, who dispatched the Macedonian cavalry to Olynthus to prevent the reinforcements. The main allied army was then assaulted by the Athenians. Although Aristeus' Corinthian wing was able to defeat the Athenians were more successful in defeating every other component of the opposing force. As he erected a column and made his way into Potidæa, Aristeus nearly perished. The Athenians, including Calais, had lost just 150 men, compared to 300 for the Peloponnesian League. After celebrating the victory with a trophy, the Athenians constructed a wall along the isthmus to the city's north. Then, under the leadership of Phormio, son of Asopius, 100 to 600 hoplites from the Athens surrounded the south. To fully isolate the city, this army constructed fortifications to the south after landing at Pallene, south of Potidæa. Aristeus, seeing how bad things were, ordered the populace to leave by sea and left a garrison of 500 troops to protect the city. Aristeus fled the city and made unsuccessful attempts to enlist Chalcedonian and Peloponnesian aid when the populace disregarded his request. When further Athenian soldiers were dispatched on Potidaea in April, the siege lasted until then. This force, which included 50 ships from Lesbos and Chios, 300 cavalry, 100 triremes, and 4,000 hoplites, was led by Cleopompus of Clinias and Hagnon of Nicias. A disease had already started to wreak havoc on Athens by April, and Hagnon's army dispersed it among the Athenian soldiers at Potidaea, where it killed 10 and 50 of his 4,000 men. Hagnon gave up and left for Athens as a result of this and the inability of his siege engines to penetrate the Potidaean walls. However, by April, Potidaea had nearly starved to death, with even some cannibalism being reported, despite Athens' failure to breach its walls. By this point, Athens and Potidaea were already at war with Sparta, and the conflict had cost them both 2,000 hoplites and exhausted portions of their treasury. As a result, they consented to relaxed terms of capitulation. The Potidaeans, along with their spouses, kids, and auxiliary forces, would be free to leave and go anywhere they pleased. In addition to money for the trip, each lady was allowed to bring 2 outfits, and each male one. With their own immigrants, the Athenians repopulated Potidaea, while maintaining authority over it. An assembly of the Appilae, the Spartan citizen assembly, was called by Sparta during the siege of Potidaea, so that a number of foreign dignitaries might speak. Speaking first, Megara, which was still under Athenian blockade, insisted that Sparta start preparing for war. The Corinthians also discussed how they had used Aegina as an example to warn the Spartans who did not trust Corinth of the Athenians' terrible imperialism. They said that by remaining inactive, Sparta was involved in Athenian imperialism. The Athenian delegation then arrived, and they announced right away that they did not view the Spartans as their judges, but rather as equals. They went on to assert that as the heroes of Hellas over the Persians, they were entitled to their hegemony, and that in effect, they had earned it by their own actions. Furthermore, they declared that they would only become the hegemons of all of Hellas if the Spartans went to war and defeated them. These talks are fictitious because they approximate Thucydides' ideas of what may have been uttered. Nonetheless, they offer hints about the overall beliefs of the fighters, as well as the geopolitical objectives of the different participants. Additionally, the Athenians said that their goals had really been very mild, thereby alerting the Spartans to the possibility of assembling even more men than they had dispatched to Potidaea. Archidamus, the king of Sparta, took the stage after Athens had finished speaking. He warned the dignitaries that the valleys of Attica may be raided by the Spartans. He cautioned the Spartans that if they launched a war now, it may very possibly be passed down to their offspring, but he himself was not among those who wanted conflict. Following all of these remarks, the appellate cast its vote by yelling, which was a popular voting method in ancient Greece. The outcome was a resounding yes to war. To prevent further escalation, Sparta attempted to send 3 diplomats to Athens, but it was too late. In the end, it will never be known for sure if the conflict between Sparta and Athens was unavoidable. But the big actors of the Athens containment era did something. Despite being constrained, Sparta had a war faction that saw the Athenians as a danger. The veracity of Thucydides' assertion that Sparta went to war because of dread of Athenian domination is up for question among contemporary historians, and a definitive decision will never be reached. We do know that the Delian and Peloponnesian leagues were headed for conflict following a protracted era of proxy conflicts and hegemonic consolidation. There will be tales of unfathomable valor and unspeakable savagery during the decades-long Peloponnesian conflicts. They would see massive geopolitical maneuvers around the Mediterranean ideological disputes among the city-states that participated in the fight, and the return of Hellenic suffering not seen since the Persian Wars. The Peloponnesian Wars therefore broke out. The first phase of the Peloponnesian War, which lasted for several decades and was started by the Spartan king Archidamus, following the Apelles' judgment, is sometimes known too as the Archidamian War. From April 31st to April, the fighting was in this phase. Thucydides explains its circumstances and causes. Although Sparta officially started the war, many Greek polis supported them because they believed the Athenians were a rising powerhouse to be feared, as a kind of guardian of the free globe. Sparta itself said that it had freed Hellas from Athenian imperialism. Athens declared itself to be a champion of democracy in the face of oppressive oligarchies. Cynical geopolitical ambitions were concealed under this reciprocal finger-pointing, which was eerily reminiscent of the Cold War of the 20th century. It should be mentioned that Thucydides' meticulous practice of detailing battles year by year has provided historians with an extensive and trustworthy primary source that makes it relatively easy to track this conflict's extraordinarily intricate changing alliances. Attica, the breadbasket of Athens, was invaded by the Peloponnesian League to start the war. In an effort to starve Athens, the Spartans and their allies would raid this area virtually year during the war. The Gulf of Corinth was shut by Athens as a countermeasure. This did not, however, stop the burnings throughout Attica, which caused to several civilian deaths from starvation and looting, and many refugees from the Attican hinterlands sought safety inside the proper walls of Athens. Many irate Athenians attacked Pericles right away, asking him why he had brought them into this conflict, as long as they could avoid fighting the Spartans on the ground, where the Spartan hoplites were most effective. Pericles calmed their fears by telling them that their battle would be won strategically, and that their unstoppable fleet would prevail. As was customary, the Spartans and their allies went home to partake in the harvest after a month following the first pillaging spree. As a result, the city of Athens honored the deceased with a public funeral at the conclusion of this year. At this funeral, Pericles delivered his famous funeral oration, or apotheos logos. Thucydides uses this occasion to analyze the ideologies of Athens and Pericles. This is evident in the passage from Logos, where Pericles honors the dead as heroes of the Athenian ideal. I would have you look at Athens' greatness day in and day out until you are filled with her love. Then, when you are struck by her splendor, consider that this empire was gained by men who knew their duty and had the courage to carry it out, who were always afraid of dishonor in times of conflict, and who, in the event that they failed in an endeavor, would not allow their virtues to be lost to their nation, but voluntarily offered their lives to her as the most honorable sacrifice they could make at her feast. The sacrifice they all made was paid back to them personally, since each of them was given the highest of all graves, and a praise that never fades. I do not refer to the place where their bones are interred, but rather to the place where their greatness endures, and is constantly and appropriately declared in both words and deeds. Because renowned guys are buried all over the planet. In addition to being honored with columns and inscriptions in their home nation, they also have an unwritten monument in other countries where they are buried in people's hearts rather than on stones. In an attempt to portray the Athenians' deaths as sacrifices committed in the pursuit of a distinct democratic ideal. The Logos is remembered as an anti-capitulation hymn. It also portrays Athens as heroic for its involvement in both military and commercial matters, in contrast to the purely militaristic Spartans. The gregarious and sea-related nature of the Athenians' way of life is praised, as is their spirit of adventure. Ironically, the plague struck Athens a year after Pericles delivered this speech, and he perished as a result. Pericles is seen by Thucydides as a powerful and innovative leader, and he is respected for this. The Peloponnesian League attempted to change the Athenian blockade off the shore of Rome, a tiny coastal community in the northwestern Peloponnese, in April. Having sent troops to both Potidaea in Macedonia and historically Dorian-leaning Crete, the Athenian fleet was already overburdened. Therefore, the Athenians had just 20 ships to oppose the Peloponnesian League, who had dispatched 47 ships, the majority of which were Corinthian in origin. The Navarre Kinemos gathered 2,000 hoplites from friendly states and 1,000 from Sparta to assault the adjacent city of Archanaia on the Peloponnesian side. The Athenians responded by sending a detachment to launch a frontal attack on Rome under the direction of a commander named Phormio, who was in charge of overseeing the blockades of both Rome and Naupactos. The outcome of the blockade was to be determined by these two engagements. The Peloponnese is closest to connecting the rest of Hellas at the shortest distance within the isthmus, and the Rome and Anti-Rome are located close to the present-day city of Patra. Because of this, it was the most strategic place to assault and the simplest to blockade. The Peloponnesians opted to utilize their trireme warships to protect these more susceptible cargo-bearing boats as they passed the narrow Rome, since they had many transport ships among them. Phormio chose to concentrate on the Peloponnesian convoy, rather than providing aid to Acarnania. Phormio was a significant naval maneuvering pioneer who made use of the weather as a crucial component of his strategy. He chose to employ an unconventional strategy after spotting the highly defended Peloponnesian triremes. He surrounded the Peloponnesian fleet with his own 20 triremes and started to approach it more closely. Slowly approaching, he launched a fake dash attack with smaller ships to push the Peloponnesian ships into a protective group. The Peloponnesians might have assaulted individual ships during their attack, but they were unable to fight back. Phormio believed the winds might be exploited against the Peloponnesians, since he had seen that they blew into the Gulf at daybreak. As Phormio had foreseen, the Peloponnesians were swept away by the wind and collided with one another when they gathered, allowing the Athenians to launch an attack. The Athenians destroyed the remaining ships and captured 12 of the Peloponnesian fleet, thereby crushing it. On the beach, Cnemus had divided his army into 3 divisions after arriving at the Acarnanian city of Stratus. Cnemus led the Ambracians and Spartans who manned the left. Leucadians and Anacoriates controlled the right, while barbarian mercenaries made up the center. Encamping the divisions and starting talks was something Cnemus himself was eager to do. Nevertheless, the center division persisted in its march, despite Cneimos's desires in the hopes of glory and loot. When they finally encountered the Stratians, they learned that the defenders were skilled barbarians and were quickly driven out. The Stratians did not exploit their advantage, since they lacked the forces to overcome the other divisions, who were taken by surprise and organized into lines. Cneimus, however, made the decision to escape the following day after learning that the remaining Acarnanians were sending reinforcements, and he met up with the Peloponnesian fleet survivors en route. Both the naval conflict at Rome and the fight of Stratia had been decisively won by the Athenians and their supporters. In the same year, Phormio was also in charge of another conflict, the Battle of Naupactus. He was stationed in Naupactus, where it all started. The Peloponnesian fleet's remnants traveled to Kyllene in the west, following the unsuccessful combat at Rome, where they encountered the Acarnanian invasion fleet and subsequently gained further reinforcements. He only had his 20 ships, since Athens dispatched reinforcements as well, but they were trapped on Crete. He took his place in the Molocrian realm, while his adversaries were in the Peloponnesian realm. Because of their small numbers, his sailors were nervous, but the Peloponnesians were also nervous because of their past defeats. The Corinthians quickly coerced Phormio into fighting in the narrow straits, despite his assurances to his fellow soldiers to the contrary. With the hoplites on land and the 20 quickest ships moving forward, the Peloponnesians formed 4 lines. Phormio entered the straits to stop them from moving east to seize the base at Naupactus. After that, the Peloponnesian fleet headed north in an attempt to ensnare the Athenians. 11 Athenian ships managed to flee, while 9 made their way onto the coast. The 20 swift Peloponnesian ships pursued the 11 sailors away, while the other 9 crews perished or were taken prisoner. 10 Athenian surviving ships entered Naupactus after 1 ship from each fleet sank as they approached the Gulf of Corinth. Athens rammed and sank a merchant ship as the 2 stranded ships arrived, igniting the rest of the ships into battle once more. The disciplined Athenian attack had wiped out the Peloponnesians who had lost their formation. They proceeded back into the trap, where they took 6 Peloponnesian ships and liberated their fellows. After the fight, both sides hoisted their prizes, but the Athenians resisted until their reinforcements showed up and took control of the Gulf of Corinth. In the same year, Spartolus, close to the doomed city of Potidæa, saw another combat, this one a defeat for the Athenians. Xenophon, not the historian son of Euripides, commanded an army of 200 cavalry and 2,000 Athenian hoplites in a march up north in Chalcidice to Spartolus, a stronghold of anti-Athenian feeling among once coastal inhabitants expelled by the Athenians. Although the city itself was defended, the defenders, who were made up of hoplites, peltasts, and auxiliary forces from Spartalos, neighboring Elynsis, and neighboring Chalcis, moved outside the city to meet Athens as soon as they arrived. The goddess Nemesis was on their side that day, but the defending hoplites were routed by the Athens hoplites, and the auxiliary forces withdrew back into the city. Shortly after the withdrawal, fresh Peltis troops showed up and started to bombard the Athenians. This reassured the defenders, and they left again. Athens attempted to push back, retreating back inside their camp, but each time they advanced, the peltasts retreated, and as the Athenians retreated, the peltasts reappeared and poured hell on them, while the cavalry attacked the intruders. The remaining Athenians fled to Potidæa in total defeat, while the remaining 400, including their generals, were murdered. Lesbos and other allies who were not particularly interested in the war were able to attempt to break away from Athenian dominance after Pericles' death. Since Athens possessed an unmatched navy at the time that could destroy any country in its alliance, they were swiftly resolved. Another city that attempted to oppose Athenian domination was Mytilene, which was able to support a number of uprisings in Ionia and the neighboring islands. What matters is that Thebes, a fierce rival of Athens and an ally of Sparta, started to intrude on Plataea. We shall get back to the uprising later. At first, two oligarchic sympathizers allowed 300 Theban hoplites to enter the city. These two Plataeans wanted to defeat the city's recently emerged democratic groups. After being stunned into surrender, the Plataeans recognized their numerical superiority and massacred more than half of the Thebans, with the remainder either being captured or fleeing. The inundation of the Asopus River prevented the Theban reinforcements from helping their dead comrades in this terrible battle. At first, both parties took solemn vows to bargain for the Theban captives' release in exchange for Plataea's isolation. The Thebans ultimately launched another attack. However, we are unsure if who violated the pledges given. The Thebans appealed to Sparta, while the Plataeans sought assistance from Athens. In a formal sense, the Peloponnesian War officially began at this point. The Peloponnesian War officially began. The Plataean ambassador reminded the Spartans that because of Plataea's holiness, they were not permitted to destroy the farmlands outside of it, even though Archidamus dispatched an invading army to do so. Plataea, which was geographically and ideologically extremely close to Athens, rejected Sparta's suggestion that they would only agree to protect them if they went neutral. By pressuring the Plataeans to reject the terms, Athens increased their confidence that they could wait for Athenian assistance. As a result, Archidamus started his siege of the city by building a wooden wall around it. He attempted to launch an attack over the city walls using the mound he had managed to construct up to the walls. In response, the Plataeans raised their walls higher and dug beneath the walls and within the Spartan mound, which caused the construction of the mound to be delayed. Using the materials from the mound, they were also able to construct new fortifications inside the city, giving them an extra line of defense in the event that the Spartans made progress. Additionally, the Spartans developed siege engines, but they were useless since the Plataeans disabled them with fire and lassos. For some time, the Spartans persisted in trying to breach Plataea's defenses, but ultimately concluded that their efforts were in vain and chose to just sit back, encircle the city, and let it starve to death. They then began launching fire missiles toward the actual city. Although fire devastated most of Plataea, the Spartans were unable to reach the defensive fortifications. Thus, their bombings merely amounted to a primitive kind of terrorism. The Spartans chose to just intensify their efforts to starve the Plataeans after this setback. The Lacedaemonians achieved this by erecting a wall of defense around Plataea and expelling a sizable portion of the besieging army, since they did not require the majority of their soldiers. Blockades are unpleasant, and the Plataeans quickly started to experience the consequences of starvation. With towers for reconnaissance and maintaining sentries, the Spartan walls were basically a two-way highway, with walls outside for Spartan defense and walls within to seal off the city. With the help of Boeotian friends, the Spartans constructed wooden towns between the walls so they could dwell within. Thucydides claims that the Plataeans had already dispatched their wives, children, oldest men, and the majority of the non-combatant population to Athens, leaving 400 of their own countrymen, 80 Athenians, and 110 women to prepare bread. At the start of the siege, this was the total, and nobody else, bond or free, was inside the walls. These were the plans put in place for the Plataean blockade. The people who lived in the city endured terrible suffering during the 2-year siege. By April, the city's supplies were running low, which made the civilian populace desperate. The decision to try to break out was made by the Plataeans. Initially, the whole city's male population was supposed to try to flee, but half of the garrison later determined that it was too risky. Ultimately, just 20 Palatine troops participated. They climbed over the walls using ladders, took control of 2 of the fortification's 10 towers, and made it over the outer wall before powerful reinforcements could reach them. The Plataean escapees had already fled to Athens when the Peloponnesian League attempted to deploy 300 troops as reinforcements. When the besiegers tried to locate the Plataeans on the way to Athens, they were tricked by their march up the road to Thebes. 12 of the fugitives eventually made it to Athens. According to Thucydides, the storm and darkness that prevailed during the night were the primary causes of their triumph. Despite making it to Athens, the escapees' cries for assistance were ignored. For fear of being pinned down, the Athenians did not send a rescue army to Plataea, maintaining Pericles' strategy of avoiding direct field conflict with Sparta. The Spartans launched their menacing attack in April, when the Plataeans and their allies inside the city were completely famished and burned out. At this time, the Spartan commander attempted to convince the besieged that submission would be preferable, that only those responsible for inciting the disturbance 2 years before would face punishment, and that the Spartans would let them keep their territory when a peace deal was ultimately concluded. These conditions were accepted, and the Plataeans gave up. But the Thebans were enraged and resentful of the Plataeans, and they immediately pressed the Spartans to deal more harshly with their defeated enemies. Consequently, the Plataeans were put on trial and given a death sentence. The women who had stayed in the city to cook for the garrison were sold into slavery, and the 200 Plataeans and 25 Athenians who had survived the siege were all put to death. To add salt to the wounds of the unfortunate city of Plataea, the Thebans burned the entire city to the ground after claiming the territory for themselves. Only when Philip of Macedon destroyed the Thebans in March would Plataea be restored. Athens' victory at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War was bittersweet. After losing their best leaders, they had triumphed in significant battles in the Peloponnese, despite overwhelming odds. But they had also demonstrated a reluctance to support their friends, which had come at a great cost to the Plataeans. The war had begun badly for the Spartans. Despite their humiliation in Rome and Naupactus, they hurried to Thebes' rescue and struck Plataea with a devastating blow. For the following 10 years, both sides would endure equal amounts of intrigues and suffering as a result of the two great powers' opposing stances. The oligarchic city-state of Mytilene in Lesbos rose up in rebellion against Athens in April. They accomplished this by working together with Sparta and its allies, especially Boeotia. As the Peloponnesian League launched its yearly invasion of the Athenian countryside, the Mytileneans who had been contemplating this insurrection for some time grabbed the chance. Thucydides said that Mytilene wanted to conquer the entire island of Lesbos in order to expand its own sphere of influence. Therefore, they hired mercenaries from the Euxenos Pontos and fortified the city as part of their first preparations. But Mytilenean overlordship was not immediately embraced by the other cities of Lesbos. Additionally, pro-democracy factions in Mytilene itself resented the way their oligarchs were leading the city in, and some lesbian cities, like the Methanians, wanted to remain with Athens. Together with the residents of Tenedos, these groups dispatched messengers to Athens to alert them about the oligarch's advances. The plague and other conflicts had left Athens too weak to step in at that time. Mytilene had time to strengthen its defenses, as a result guaranteeing the success of the uprising. Athens had intended to launch an attack beyond the city walls during the Apollo festival, when it finally got around to dealing with Mytilene. But after learning of the Athenian surprise attack, the Mytileneans chose to confront them from inside their stronghold. They were beaten when 40 Athenian triremes confronted the fleet outside the city. Negotiations then started, and Mytilene sent runners to Sparta in advance to try to get Lacedaemonian support for the proceedings. The Mytilenean army swiftly left the city and assaulted the Athenian camp after negotiations broke down. The Mytileneans fled back behind their walls, preferring to go on the defensive, while the Athenians were damaged but not completely disabled. The island of Lesbos was legally admitted as an ally of the Peloponnesian League when Sparta took the issue to the League. After that, Sparta planned an assault on Attica at Olympia, but the harvest season delayed her allies' arrival. After learning of this, Athens threatened the League by deploying 100 vessels that were employed for Peloponnese raids. On the meantime, Mytilene attempted to invade Methymna and other cities on Lesbos, but was repulsed. The Athenians started a formal siege on the dissident city by April. Mytilene was utterly encircled, vulnerable to famine, and entirely dependent on a Spartan navy of 40 ships under Alcidar's command. The fleet did not set sail until the summer of 427 BCE, making it notoriously late to arrive. Overall, the Mytileneans found themselves in an extremely challenging position. There was not much time left, and assistance was probably not arriving in time. In the end, they agreed to engage in talks. Although Athens may have appeared to have won easily, this was actually a Pyrrhic victory. Athens's resources were severely taxed after fighting the naval battle on the Isthmus, defending against the yearly assault into Attica, and providing funds for the siege of Mytilene. In light of this, we move on to the notorious Mytilenean argument, which took place in the city's agora, which the poets adored. The strain of the battle and the Mytileneans' impudence, which had caused them so much hardship, infuriated the Athenians. Therefore, it was proposed to sell the women into slavery and execute all of Mytilene's male population. A trireme was sent to carry out the action, but the Athenians debated it again the next day, with the moral center of their community speaking out against senseless killing. Thucydides characterizes Cleon as the most vicious man in Athens, and he was the one driving the massacre. He asserted that expediency was crucial, and that Athens was wasting time with sophistry rather than punishing. Therefore, the greatest deterrent would be to punish the Mytileneans. Therefore, instead of betraying yourself, try to remember the time of anguish and the value you placed on their diminution. Then give them back in kind, without letting your current weakness or the danger that once loomed over you fade. Give them the punishment they deserve, and set a powerful example for your fellow supporters that rebellion carries a death sentence. Once they realize this, you won't have to ignore your adversaries as frequently as you do while battling your own allies. Diodotus, a man opposed to the sentence, then appeared. He emphasized that hostility would be ineffective and that Athens should behave moderately. Admit that this is the best course of action, and without giving in too much to indulgence or sympathy, neither of which are the reasons why I or Cleon want you to be swayed by the obvious merits of the case at hand. Be convinced that I should try the Mytileneans that Pappy sent off as guilty in a calm manner and leave the others alone. Since sound policy against an enemy is preferable to the mindless attacks of raw force. This is both the best course of action for the future and the worst thing you can do to your adversaries right now. Athens ultimately changed its mind by a narrow majority vote. To prevent the extinction of a whole demos, a second trireme was sent and arrived at Mytilene just in time. Thucydides had to observe that it was an unusual instance of kindness in a conflict notorious for its ruthlessness. As April arraigned, Athens was becoming increasingly aggressive, and discussions about the next steps were now taking place in the agora. They ultimately chose to launch a huge attack on the Spartan allied states of Boeotia and Aetolia. Many of Athens' supporters in nearby Messenia had pushed for the campaign to take place according to their wishes. Two sizable contingents were first dispatched by the Athenians. Demosthenes was in charge of one, which was to blockade the Corinthian Gulf and sail across the Peloponnese. The others attacked Tanagara Melos and Boeotia under Nicias's leadership. In order to fulfill his pledge to besiege Leuca, Demosthenes first succeeded in gathering a sizable army of his supporters from Messenia, Corcyria, and Acarnania. However, many of his friends turned against him because he intended to divide the force in two and obtain further soldiers from Phorcys to travel to Aetolia first. Demosthenes proceeded to Locris, where he set up a base from which to launch his assault on Aetolia, but the Aetolians had gathered soldiers and intelligence that would allow them to easily beat the Athenians. During this time, Athens' greatest vulnerability was its ranged troops, namely its javelin throwers, of whom the Aetolians were very proficient. Towns like Aegidium were deserted when Demosthenes arrived, because the locals had gathered into guerrilla bands and fled to the mountains. Only Athenian allied auxiliary were able to reply at all with arrow fire, as the defenders continuously attacked the Athenians using the rough terrain. Demosthenes ended up without a guide, which made things worse and caused further unrest among his soldiers. As a result, the Athenian expeditionary army was completely destroyed, and Athens and her allies suffered casualties that were higher than usual. Athens and its allies suffered above-average losses from the Athens expeditionary force. Demosthenes was compelled to withdraw to Naupactos, his former base. His reputation was damaged, thus he was reluctant to go back to Athens. As a result, he kept fighting in naval conflicts and achieved success at Ophi and Idomene. Since the two fights took place against the backdrop of the Aetolian War, they essentially transpired back to back. Following the Aetolians' appeal for assistance, the Spartans initially attempted to use 3,000 hoplites to conquer the city of Naupactus. The Locrians, who had pledged to aid the Athenians but had changed their minds and joined the opposing side, assisted these hoplites in their siege of the city. Despite defeating the Naupactian detachment and capturing the outer walls, Sparta was unable to capture the city in time. When Demosthenes learned of the siege, he requested and obtained 1,000 Acarnanian hoplites, rushed to the city, and forced Eurylochus, the Spartan commander, to break the siege. His current objective is to conquer Acarnania by traveling to the Amphilochian city of Argos. The Spartans positioned themselves on a hill near Proscium after his local supporters, the Ambraciotes, pledged to provide him with troops in the winter. As promised, 3,000 hoplites from the Ambraciotes joined them, and the united troops gathered at Olpi. Demosthenes gladly sent reinforcements after the Acarnanians shifted their forces to Argos and the neighboring hill of Ophi. He arrived with 200 Messenian hoplites and 20 triremes, 60 Athenian archers, and set up camp across a valley. Eurylochos was on the right, followed by the Mantinean allies, while mixed contingents were on the left and center of the Peloponnesians. Demosthenes and the Athenians faced Eurylochos, while the Acarnanians and Antilochian javelin throwers faced them. The Ambraciotes first overcame their adversaries on the other side and advanced on Argos. They attempted to outflank Demosthenes from the left as well, but he had 400 hoplites and light infantry concealed in bushes for an easy surprise attack. In addition to the displaced Mantineans, these covert soldiers suddenly appeared behind the Peloponnesian left flank, which immediately descended into pandemonium. The Ambraciotes attempted to flee to Olpi, after arriving barely in time to witness the complete catastrophe engulfing their side of the conflict. Nevertheless, they were also heavily wounded in the Acarnanians' onslaught. The conflict claimed the life of Eurylochos, and Menedaius, his successor, requested that the dead be retrieved and that they be sent to safety. Demosthenes, ever the populist, only granted the first request and permitted Menedaius, the Mantineans, and a few chosen Peloponnesians to go for the second. This may have been done to harm their reputation, as the Ambraciotes lost 200 additional men to the Athenians when they attempted to withdraw with the Spartans. 2 days later, Idomene took place when Demosthenes discovered that the Spartan troops in the south were advancing from Ambracia in that direction. Therefore, he dispatched troops to halt their progress, and the two forces, the Ambraciotes on the lower hill and the Athenians on the higher hill, camped on the hills of Idomene. Along with a group of Acarnanians, Amphilochians, Messenians, and Athenians, Demosthenes also relocated there at night. He confused the Ambracians, who spoke the same dialect, by placing the Dorian Messenians in first place in a cunning ploy fit for Odysseus. They assaulted the Ambracians before daybreak, and the Doric-speaking ninja onslaught unsurprisingly startled and caught them off guard. There was a slaughter in the camp, and more Ambraciots perished during the difficult withdrawal. Over 1,000 individuals perished in the defeat, which Thucydides said had one of the worst death ratios of any city. But the conclusion was unexpected. The Ambraciotes, Antilochians, and Acarnanians signed a covenant of mutual peace, agreeing to cooperate in any invasion as long as neither side was engaged. This was probably done out of concern that the area would become overly influenced by Athens. Following a successful campaign of Spartan diplomacy, the city of Messina in Sicily rose up against Athens in April. In response, Demosthenes came up with the plan to use Pylos as a base from which to launch an attack on Sparta with the Messenians' assistance. He made this suggestion twice to unfavorable answers, but the Athenians retreated because of the storms and eventually found themselves on Pylos, where they started constructing fortifications. The yearly invasion of Attica occurred at this time. However, the Spartan king Agis dispatched ships and men to Pylos, then withdrew his army back to Sparta when he learned that Athenian marines were arriving on the doorstep of his own city. From Zakynthos, Athens brought their squadrons. Only 60 ships were under the hands of Athens compared to 90 under the Spartan commanders Brasidas and Thrasimilitis. Sparta blocked the island of Sphacteria and its natural harbor moored ships and started attacking the defenses. Demosthenes, always quick with his strategic thinking, moved a small group to the area where the Spartans were most likely to assault. The remaining hoplites were still in the army. Under Thrasimilitis, who commanded 43 of the 90 Spartan ships, Sparta launched its attack, but the port was too tiny for all of them to strike simultaneously. Squadrons of smaller boats continually entered the bay, but were constantly driven out by the Athenians. The Spartans gave up on active attacks and dug in for a siege after 2 days of unsuccessful strikes on the walls. But before they could completely establish themselves, the Athenian fleet arrived and engaged the Spartan fleet, causing significant damage to the Spartan navy. The defenses were located in the harbor between Sphacteria and Pylos, which the Spartans occupied with their navy. Now stranded between the Spartan equivalent of the legendary clashing rocks Demosthenes and the Argonauts, were able to repel the Spartans until the very last minute when the Athenian fleet arrived. Now, 420 Spartan hoplites were ensnared on Sphacteria under Epictetus. The Spartans dispatched several officials to examine the issue because it was unprecedented. The officials made the decision to start ceasefire negotiations with their enemy, since supplies could no longer be supplied to the island. They were ready to bargain because of Sparta's special constitution, which was centered on the limited number of homi as the military force and citizens. This meant that any loss of manpower may have catastrophic long-term effects. It was too maximalist to accept Athens' requests for all the land they had already lost in the conflict. As the battle recommenced, Sparta and Sphacteria were under siege by Athens across Pylos. Sparta's attempts to supply Sphacteria were unsuccessful, but Athens also continued to be under siege. The notorious populist Cleon, who had advocated for the rejection of earlier agreements with Sparta, was now in a difficult position. He had been attempting to hold Nicias, the current leader of the Athenian army, responsible for Athens' recent lack of success. However, the Athenians were not having it and demanded to know why Cleon did not take over the operation if Nicias's performance was so poor. Cleon's hand was pushed in embarrassment, and he gathered some additional troops and declared victory within 20 days. The Spartans had unintentionally burned the islet's trees when Cleon got there, exposing several landing spots and destroying their concealment. Demosthenes and Cleon dispatched envoys once more, but the Spartans refused to accept any surrender. The Spartans were divided into 3 camps, one facing Pylos, one on the outskirts of a fort, and Epictetus in the middle. In the midst of the night, the Spartans were attacked by 800 hoplites from Athens. Following the loss of the first Spartan station, 800 archers and 800 peltasts made their landing. They ringed the key Spartan stronghold with the sailors and the allied contingents. As a result, the main Spartan force was encircled and exposed to both flanking attacks. The Spartans were pelted with hell by the Athenians, who dispatched bowmen, peltasts, and stone throwers. Since the island fort was a last option, the latter withdrew there. Since the Delian League was unable to enter the fort, they managed to withstand the Athenian assault there. Eventually, the Messenian commander marched over the rocky shore of the island with a small contingent of light infantry and archers. From the high ground, he encircled the fort and started firing missiles at its defenders. Epictetus was killed during the chaos, and Cleon and Demosthenes stopped fighting and again sent heralds to negotiate. The herald's arrival was greeted with lowered shields, a symbol of exhaustion and a desire for surrender, even though Spartans are notorious for not wishing to surrender. In the end, every Spartan hoplite put down their weapons. The Athenians were both ecstatic and dismayed. The remaining 40 hoplites were either medics or allies, whereas the 440 who had been caught were either Homi or full Spartan citizens. The Greek world was filled with astonishment and wonder as word of the capitulation spread. Regardless of the odds against them, the Spartans had a history of never giving up. It was therefore incomprehensible to many Greeks that a group of Spartan hoplites had surrendered before an Athenian foe. Since this was an unusual diplomatic position for the Spartan state, they were perhaps the most surprised of everyone. This issue stretched on for years, much like the well-known prisoner exchanges between warring nations today and provisions requiring the release of all Spartan captives held in Athenian or Delian captivity were crucial to the Peace of Nicaea 4 years later. Sparta and Athens had been in a state of chaos throughout the last 4 years of conflict. Athens faced an extraordinary uprising with Mytilene as the yearly invasions of Attica persisted and the city recovered from the plague. Their friends suffered a tremendous deal as a result of their victory. Aetolia, too, saw chaos on the front lines, and even though Athens later achieved significant wins, the loss of manpower was nevertheless astounding. Nevertheless, Athens recovered and humiliated Sparta in Pylos and Sphacteria, in addition to winning battles at sea. Sparta had failed, and Athens now had the advantage in the war, at least for the time being. It was also inevitable that the Athenians would lose steam since they had overextended. The final chapter of the Archidamian War is drawing near, but not before a number of titanic conflicts have taken place. Furthermore, even if peace is first achieved, there will be too much bloodshed and arrogance from triumphs for it to last, and conflict will return to Greek households. There will be more conflict on Hellas's beaches, which will allow the Hellenes to experience greater glory and grief. Athens planned more expeditions while waging war against Sparta at Pylos and Sphacteria. The Greek area of Boeotia, which borders Attica, was home to several cities that were Athens' competitors, including Megara and Thebes. Together with his colleague Demosthenes Cleon, the notorious populist and brutal Athenian warmonger was returned to power in April, following his resounding victory in Sphacteria. This has been seen by many academics as a win for the Athens Warhawks. The election of Nicias and Thucydides, however, demonstrated that the Athenians continued to favor conservative moderation. In April, a campaign against Boeotia was decided. However, prior to it, the Athenians made the decision to assault the Spartan Perioeci in Kythera, an island off the Peloponnese coast. After handily defeating Kythera, the Athenian navy established garrisons and forts on the island to use as a base of operations for an invasion of the Peloponnese. The Athenian fortunes were worse to the west. Only the city of Messina was captured during the April raid on Sicily, and the Athenians were forced to a defensive posture by the army of Syracuse's ongoing assault. As a result, the Boeotia campaign received the majority of Athens' military attention. Megara, a city that had endured yearly Athenian incursions into their countryside, similar to what the Peloponnesian League had done to Attica, was one of their primary objectives. Athens skillfully took advantage of the civil war that broke out in Megara between democratic and oligarchic groups as a result of the economic upheaval this had wrought. Fearing a coup and unable to rely on the Peloponnesian League, the democratic faction looked to Athens for assistance. They asserted that Megara would be turned over to the Atticans if Athens could breach the lengthy walls separating it from Nicaea, a garrison town in the Peloponnesian League. Arriving from Minoia and showing up at night with its friends, Athens set out to accomplish precisely that. At Nicaea, the port was blockaded and the gates were opened. This was simple enough, but the Athenians faced resistance since the famous Spartan leader Brasidas was stationed close by in Boeotia. Brasidas disseminated information about the Athenian play for Megara among the Boeotia cities. They promptly gathered 400 hoplites from Phlius, 700 from Sixion, and 2,700 from Corinth, and marched in the direction of the city. By the time they got there, Athens had captured the interior of Nicaea and captured the Spartan garrison there. Brasidas chose to wait for the inevitable Athenian departure on the outskirts of Megarae rather than attempt to retake Nicaea. After first refusing to allow Brasidas to enter their city, the Megarians finally gave up. Thucydides claims that Brasidas refrained from attacking right away because doing so would force Athens to flee to Nicaea and incur fewer losses. As a result, they remained at odds until the Athenians made the decision to leave. The disloyal Democrats who had collaborated with Athens were driven out of Megara shortly after an oligarchic rebirth. For the remainder of the Peloponnesian Wars, Megara would remain a steadfast Spartan ally, proving the political axiom that no foreigner can successfully conquer a region without native support. With its Boeotian campaign, Athens had a lot on its plate. At first, Hippocrates and Demosthenes intended to launch an assault from both the sea and the land. Southern Greece's Phocis, a portion of Phocia that was allied with Sparta, was a suitable landing place for a naval attack. Phocis was well situated to manage supplies and communications from the Peloponnese to Boeotia proper, since it possessed a shore on the Corinthian Gulf. Demosthenes was conspiring with certain Phocians who supported the Athenians in the hopes of capturing the city in the same way that they intended to capture Megara. As a result, he organized his army with Hippocrates, who was to assault Delium on land. But at Phocis, someone had told the pro-Spartan authorities of the presence of the pro-Athenian saboteurs. As a result, Demosthenes was not permitted to disembark at Phocis proper, and instead traveled farther down the Corinthian Gulf to the region of Siphae. The Athenians wasted important time and found life much more difficult as a result. Hippocrates did not fare much better. He was now forced to march by himself to Delium. The little city of Delium was situated in a key strategic area. It was also close to the city of Tanagra and an Apollo temple. Hippocrates organized a sizable landed army to combat the local Boeotian and Peloponnese forces. With both active fighting and a siege of the tiny town and its defenses, the ensuing conflict was infamous for its duration and intensity. In the end, the Athenians lost the competition as well as their captain. By this point, the public's sentiment was moving toward peace, and both sides of the conflict were overburdened. This would take some time to develop, though, and there were still a lot of long-term wartime tactics in use. A one-year truce was agreed upon in April, so that both parties could heal their wounds and attempt to bring about peace in the future. The Battle of Amphipolis, which took place mostly in April and featured Thucydides himself, is one example of this transition towards a truce. Thrace's Amphipolis was a significant city because of its silver mines. During the battles between the warring leagues in April, Brasidas invaded Thrace from the north and besieged Delium, which General Eucles resisted. There were no such dissidents within the Amphiporean ranks when the Spartans first encircled the city and attempted to persuade traders to let them inside. Our historian extraordinaire stayed with his army in the harbor town of Eion, which Euclius dispatched a courier to reach. Brasidas was aware that Amphipolus' will to battle would be stoked by the renowned regional commander Thucydides. Thus, before his Athenian opponent showed up, the Spartan general struck a bargain. He gave the Amphipolitans 5 days to decide whether to stay and keep their entire property or to depart and take it with them. A few hours before Thucydides arrived, the city gave up after considerable discussion. Thucydides was banished from Athens after being found entirely liable for the defeat. He remained in Thrace and started writing the battle narrative we are now talking about. Amphipolus and all other currently occupied territories could be retained by the people who had them, thanks to the April ceasefire. Before the ceasefire, which was also part of the pact, was finalized, Brasidas was able to seize Seone. When the ceasefire finally expired, Athens began to worry about its grain supplies and silver mines coming in from its friends on the Bosporus, which was still extremely close to Amphipolus. In order to do this, the hawkish Cleon decided to recover the city for Athens' honor. He assembled a naval force that was able to conquer Seone before arriving at Amphipolus. Brasidas, meantime, had strengthened the Spartans by pursuing his war in areas that the treaty did not cover. He swiftly retook Seone with 200 hoplites, 300 cavalry, and 30 ships. After seizing Tauron, he took up residence at Ion, the harbor where Thucydides had established himself 2 years before. After that, Brasidas deployed his soldiers to the vicinity, showing up on the site of Cerdylium with a view of Amphipolus and the Athenian army as well as the high ground. Now, Brasidas and Cleon stood still, waiting for the other to make a move. Ida's army won. Local peltasts, 500 Thracian mercenaries, 300 Greek cavalry, and 2,000 hoplites now made up Brasidas' force. As the two armies waited, Thucydides' description of what happened next got more and more hazy. According to the historian, the Athenians were irritated and irate because they did not believe that their leader Cleon would not act rashly. Cleon consented to bring the troops and examine the city as a result. In contrast to Thucydides, contemporary historian Donald Cargan thinks that Cleon's true plan was to survey the city while he waited for his Thracians to arrive. In this manner, they might quickly reclaim the city by encircling it. Brasidas himself must have hoped to have forces hidden for a surprise attack while he waited for a potential siege. Brasidas made the decision to personally lead 150 of his finest warriors into the heart of Athens. While his second-in-command Clearidas was to arrange himself and his forces in the northern section of the city and launch an attack, they were to operate as a type of vanguard, operating from the city's southerly entrance. Brasidas was sure that he would serve as a distraction and cause mayhem for the following onslaught, even if this was a hazardous move. As Cleon conducted his reconnaissance alone in front of the troops, he discovered that the majority of the enemy was located in the north. Cleon gave the command for his soldiers to withdraw through the southernmost gate because he was unwilling to assault without his reinforcements. The cavalry had also been left behind, and the left wing of the Athenian army soon fanned back to Aeon as Clearidas started to move from the north. The right wing started to retreat with Cleon under personal command. The populous Cleon, whom Thucydides had little regard for because of his bravado and demagoguery, was reputedly killed by a Messenian peltast. Thus, according to Thucydides, Cleon started to run away before the Messenian could kill him. But according to some accounts, Cleon battled valiantly all the way to the death. When Brasidas noticed that the Athenian army's shields were strewn about, he jumped right in. Through the southernmost gate, he led his 150 warriors to attack the Athenian center, causing complete confusion. Then, when Clearidas finally fought from the north, Brasidas turned on the Athenian right flank. The others had long since escaped and made a sort of final stand, leaving the Athenian right wing alone. Here, the valiant and daring Brasidas was killed while charging the last Athenian defenders. He was removed from the battlefield, his life gushing from his body, and he wouldn't pass away until he had been informed of his victory. In his works, Thucydides characterizes the Spartan commander with praise, stating that he was both cunning and knowledgeable in his behavior, even if he had previously lost a battle against Brasidas. He was thereafter honored as the founder of Amphipolis, where he was buried. The rest of the Athenian right wing moved to a neighboring hill and battled to the very end. After 3 attacks, in which Clearidas and his army were driven back by the Athenians, he finally encircled them with his infantry, cavalry, and peltasts. The enemy's formation was then destroyed by a shower of missiles. Dispersed, the Athenians retreated to Eion. 600 Athenians had been killed in combat by the time they got there. Thucydides claims that just 7 soldiers were lost by the Spartans and their allies. As a result, both of the war's most pro-war generals perished at the Battle of Amphipolis, which resulted in a stunning Spartan triumph. The 2 emblems of aggressive politics in Sparta and Greece had died after Amphipolis. Ramphius, Brasidas' successor, saw that the atmosphere at home was not favorable and stopped raiding Thrace. Sparta was exposed because Athens, in spite of its defeats, still maintained strongholds at Pylos and Cythera. Despite concerns about attacks for the latter and the loss of grain supply for the former, both cities were far more in the mood for peace than they had been before. In order to negotiate a peace treaty, Pleistoanax, the king of Sparta, and Nicias, the commander from Athens, from whom the peace is named, met. There was much wrangling about things like the release of the Athenian captives from Thebes and the release of these Bactrian prisoners from Athens. Cities in Thrace that were freed by Sparta were to become neutral, but they continued to pay the tribute that Aristeus the Just had given them to the Athenians. Not the Athenians, not the higher April homage, with the exception of Nicaea, which remained under Athenian rule, and Plataea, which remained with Thebes. All land was essentially restored to each alliance. Throughout Hellas, stelae bearing the holy pledge taken by the 2 sides were constructed, and all temples were once again accessible to pilgrims. Numerous problems remained, such as the fact that Amphipolis was still under Spartan control. The pact was disliked by many of Sparta's allies, who declined to sign it. As a result, it was an uncomfortable peace imposed by parties that were unable to win or lose the conflict. Furthermore, neither side was prepared for such a protracted conflict, and naturally, the rest of the Hellenic world had also been harmed. This indicated that a lasting solution had not yet been reached. As the April Dionysia unfolded, and the Athenians gathered to watch Aristophanes' notorious comedy, peace, the Hellenic world would descend into a cold war as Sparta and Athens eyed each other with suspicion and anxiety. Meanwhile, the Peloponnesian Wars would not officially resume until April. Finally, they were able to exhale a sigh of relief, although a brief one. Not every participant in either coalition agreed with the terms of the Peace of Nicias. For example, the pledges of peace had not been taken by the Megarians and the Boeotians. The peace agreement was particularly unpopular, with some Thracian colonies that were forced to return to a system of governance akin to Athens. The two most powerful cities that rejected the peace were Corinth and Thebes. After conquering Plataea, Thebes was growing aggressively ambitious, and Corinth's disputes with Athens had not been settled. This placed Sparta in a challenging position, since they were more constrained by their allies than Athens, and were no longer the most powerful member of their own coalition. Argos and Mantinea, among other Peloponnesian League members, started to turn away from Sparta and informally align themselves with Athens. Nicias was keen to establish a stable peace on land in order to recover from the war, because he saw that political unrest in mainland Greece would impede Athenian interests and growth abroad. This was unacceptable to Athens' commercial rival Corinth, who went to Argos to construct a third political pole in opposition to the Agora and the Apella. In addition, they intimidated Sparta into hearing their requests by threatening to leave the Peloponnesian League. This possibility frightened Sparta. It would shatter the geopolitical security of Sparta if enough armies broke away and joined an archival pact. In front of a group of influential archives, the Corinthians presented them with several partnership possibilities, which the archives enthusiastically approved. Mantinea and other cities soon joined this new coalition, led by Corinth. Sparta was furious when they learned about this. This never happened because Corinth and Boeotia broke away from Sparta, which meant that they would no longer be protected from Athens. As a result of developments in Athens spearheaded by Hyperbolus and a certain Alcibiades Pericles' nephew, who would play a crucial role in the remainder of the war, tensions between Athens and Boeotia escalated. Alcibiades managed to marginalize the pro-peace Nicias in the Agora by using the destruction of Panactum to further his pro-war cause. Alcibiades formed an alliance with Mantinea Argos and Ilus after accusing Sparta of breaching their half of the bargain. Through these alliances, Athens positioned itself as a defender of democracy amid the strategically significant city that, if captured, would isolate Corinth from the rest of the world. After a prompt response, the Spartans engaged the Argives and their Athenian allies outside of Argos itself. Agis II, the king of Sparta, chose to negotiate instead of combat, which resulted in a peaceful conclusion with his warriors returning home. But this infuriated the Spartans, who insisted that aggressiveness be repaid with aggression. The hoplites of Lacedaemonia so marched back to fight. Following their conquest of Epidaurus, the Argives advanced on the city of Tegaea, which dispatched emissaries requesting assistance or risked switching sides. King Agis's army, which Thucydides describes as the best in Greece, was made up of around 9,000 soldiers, comprising 500 Spartans, 600 Skyrite, 2,000 Neodymides, 3,000 Tegean allies and cavalry. The Spartans responded swiftly, with 3,000 Argives, 1,000 Athenian hoplites and cavalry, 2,000 Mantineans, 1,000 Cleones, Onaeans, and Hegetons. The Argive army, on the other hand, numbered perhaps 8,000. After traveling to Mantinea, which is close to Argos, King Agis launched a raid on the area. Agis ordered his ditch diggers to alter the valley's flow, forcing Argos to relocate as the Argives took up positions on the hill next to Mantinea. Coming down from the hill, the united Argives spread their wings. The Argives were in the middle, while the Mantineans were on the right, next to the Arcadians. The Athenian infantry and cavalry were on the far left, while the Cleonaeans and Oeneans were more to the left. Agis gave his soldiers the command to form combat lines as soon as the allied army appeared in front of the Spartans. The Syrites, Spartans, and a few liberated Helots made up the left. The Arcadians followed by the Tegeans and Maelians. Both wings were protected by cavalry, while the right was composed of a small contingent of Spartans. When the two armies met, they stretched their right wings and collided. Agis directed Spartans to fill up the space while he shifted the Skyrite to the left. The Mantineans routed the Scythians and Thracians on the left flank, but the Spartans swiftly overcame the Argive advantage. King Agis valiantly held the line in the middle, avoiding a complete Spartan rout, while the Mantineans and Argive warriors advanced to crush the Spartan forces and suffer severe casualties, forcing them to flee. Thus, the right wing was able to outflank the Athenians, while the core contingents were routed by the Spartans. Only the Athenian cavalry prevented the troops from being completely surrounded. The Athenians were able to escape when Agis gave the command for his men to protect the left. During the conflict, the Argives and their supporters sustained significant losses. 700 soldiers were lost by the Argives, 200 by the Mantinees, and 200 by the Athenians and Agamemnon, including their two generals, Laches and Nicostratus. Spartan losses were somewhat less than 300. Only after reaching a ceasefire with Argos did they begin to pursue the Athenians out of Epidaurus. The Argives' bid to rule the Peloponnese came to an end the next year when they made peace with Sparta. The remaining members of the anti-Spartan coalition fell apart once Argos left. Despite their military confrontations, Sparta and Athens remained formally at peace with no violations of the provisions of the Peace of Nicias. The internal politics of both towns remained tight. Following the War of Mantinea and the peace that persisted between Athens and Sparta was more strained than before. Both Nicias and Alcibiades barely escaped banishment in the form of ostracism at Athens. After avoiding this possible exile, Nicias concentrated on sending expeditions into Chalkidiki to reclaim territory that had been taken by the Spartan general Brasidas years before. King Agis maintained his adept military leadership in Sparta. Argos rebelled again, just a year after the Battle of Mantinea. Alcibiades assisted the Argives in overthrowing their oligarchs and attempting to impose a democracy that would of course favor Athens. Agis hurried back to Argos in reply. He demolished the lengthy fortifications that connected Argos to its port, but he did not capture the city. Subsequently, he captured the hill of Hise, which was home to an unnamed settlement, and killed every man living there. The Argive oligarchs were eventually installed by the Spartans at Orne, a mountainous town they had taken in April and which they considered to be their offshore paradise. Through these Argive exiles, they launched a proxy war against Argos. Argos and Athens joined forces in retaliation. After a bloody siege, they captured the city of Orne with 40 triremes and 200 hoplites, during which the Argive exiles were either killed or driven out. Athens' division persisted as April approached, with both pro-war and pro-peace generals winning re-election. Athens was keen to attempt to broaden its interests and had restocked its funds by this point. The island of Milos, a boundary area between the two leagues, was destined to be the object of Athens' anger by the Olympians and the Three Fates. One of the most well-known passages from Thucydides, it has generated fervent discussion and timeless teachings. a Spartan colony in the Cyclades. Milos remained neutral and could have provided financial support to the Spartans during the Archidamian conflict. With 300 ships, 200 hoplites, 300 archers, and 20 mounted archers, Athens arrived on the island. 8 ships and 500 hoplites were dispatched by their allies. They established a blockade and encircled the island. They also caused a famine by burning the farms surrounding the island. The Athenians then dispatched an ambassador to beg the Melians to give up without a struggle. This is where the notorious Melian discussion takes place. In response, the Melians invoked their neutrality and remarked on how foolish it would be for Athens to attack an island like theirs that had not harmed them. They also said that it would be dishonorable for them to give up without a struggle. Millions. To be fair, there is nothing wrong with us quietly giving each other instructions as you suggest, but your military preparations are too far along to support your claims. As we can see, you have become judges of your own cause, and the only realistic outcome of this negotiation is war. If we turn out to be correct and refuse to submit, or conversely, slavery. Athens said that it would be folly to resist, and that they would assault since they had the might of force on their side. For our part, we won't bother you with false pretenses, such as claiming that we are entitled to our empire because we toppled the Mede, or that we are fighting you now because you wronged us. Throw the meadow, or we're assaulting you now for the injustice you did to us, and give a lengthy speech that no one would believe. And in exchange, we expect that you would aim for what is practical while keeping in mind our true feelings, rather than trying to sway us by claiming that you did not join the Lacedaemonians, despite the fact that they are colonists, or that you have done us no damage. You and I both know that although the powerful do what they can, and the weak endure what they must, the world is only a contest between equals in strength. Millions. Since you have instructed us to leave rights alone and only discuss topics of interest, we feel that we are obligated to protect our common protection, the right to invoke what is fair and right in the face of danger, and even the ability to profit from arguments that are not strictly valid if they can be persuaded to pass. And since your downfall would be a sign for the most severe retaliation and a model for the rest of the world to follow, you are as interested in this as anybody else. The Athenians said that they would be spared a worse destiny of total annihilation when the Melians questioned why they should give up and not fight. They went on to explain that friendship with Milos was insufficient, since it would give the impression that they were weak in the eyes of their allies. Athenians. In terms of right, they believe that one has just as much of it as the other, and that if someone manages to stay independent, it's because they are strong, and that we are fearful if we don't harass them. So that in addition to expanding our dominion, your submission should increase our security. The fact that you are weaker than others and islanders makes it the more crucial that you fail to confound the sea's lords. They had to rely on the Peloponnese. Milos said, and fighting them may invite a Peloponnesian invasion. Millions. You may be confident that unless the terms are equal, we understand just as well as you how tough it is to compete with your wealth and influence. But since we are merely men battling against injustice, we have faith that the gods will offer us luck as good as yours. We also believe that the union of the Lacedaemonians, who are obligated to help their family, if only out of shame, will provide us with the strength we desire. Therefore, our optimism is not so completely illogical after all. Athenians. When you talk about the gods' favor, we may just as easily pray for it as you do. Pretensions or actions that are in any manner at odds with what people believe about the gods or do among themselves are neither. According to an essential law of their nature, the gods and mankind we know govern wherever they can. Furthermore, it is not as though we were the first to enact this law or to put it into effect. We discovered it already there, and will let it continue to exist indefinitely after us. We just utilize it, knowing that you and everyone else with the same amount of power as us would follow suit. The Athenians fled after a fruitless discussion and started the siege. For the most of April, Milos persisted. They were compelled to surrender, nevertheless, since they soon started to starve under siege. Because of how brutal the Athenian retaliation was, some contemporary historians have called it genocide. Every woman and kid in Milos was sold into slavery, and every man was put to death. Athens' desire for war increased in April, particularly with Syracuse, whose rule over Sicily they wished to overthrow. Nicias, ever the moderate, pointed out that a journey that far west would be absurd. But despite Sicily's vastness, Alcibiades was keen to demonstrate his abilities and thought it was an easy target. The Athenian agora then made the decision to decide the outcome of the war. They would take their triremes and set sail for Sicily in order to aid the city of Sogesta and subjugate it to Athens. Centuries later, Plutarch describes the abundance of foreboding signs, including a maniac who used a stone to castrate himself in front of the altar of the 12. Ravens tore away the monument grove honoring Athens' triumph in the Persian Wars, and the priestess of Clasimene arrived in the city with the name Hesychia, which means peace or quietude. Alcibiades still mustered the men and started to sail. However, the community was shocked when the Hermes statues on the Athenian crossroads were vandalized before they sailed. Alcibiades was accused of the crime by his adversaries. Thousands of Athenians were forced to settle farther west than they could have ever dreamed after Alcibiades successfully defended himself and sailed to Sicily. Even though Sparta was not directly involved, the Sicilian expedition would turn out to be a pivotal moment in the Peloponnesian War, and the Hermes controversy would continue to plague him. We can only picture the excitement of the excursion, as well as the shock and terror that Athens may have experienced as the vandalized monuments lay in the city streets. A dreadful fear, but one that pales in comparison to the terror that the millions would have experienced during their own demise. Since this film has only touched on Sicily in passing, we will start with a quick overview of the island's history and geopolitics. The Hellenic world had been aware of Sicily since the Bronze Age, and Greek and Phoenician colonies were established on the island's coast in the early Archaic era. Sicily had several colonial city-states and a political landscape as complicated as mainland Greece by the 4th century BC. The largest city was Syracuse, a wealthy commercial center that alternated between autocratic and democratic regimes on a regular basis. Syracuse fought foreign incursions and attempted to resolve intra-island disputes in its favor, defending its area of influence on the island. For its part, Athens viewed the minor Ionian colonies on the island as a counterbalance to Syracuse and had some political and cultural links to them. Syracuse and other Dorian colonies on the island shared similar connections with Sparta. In spite of this, Athens's April military engagement in Sicily marked a new boundary for them that had never been seen before. 500 hoplites, 400 archers, 700 slingers, 120 additional light infantry, 30 cavalry, and 134 triremes made up the enormous military commitment. It was accompanied by Lamachos and the city's leading generals, Nicias and Alcibiades. Witnesses were called. Athens' quasi-political mystery clubs were held accountable, and the Hermes scandal raged as Athens set sail. Donald Kagan feels that Alcibiades was not a part of the sacrilege, although he was a member of some of the oligarchic clubs. After gathering forces from its allies, Athens sailed initially, landing on the southern Italian east coast, close to Rhegium in present-day Calabria. Rhegium reflected the chilly greeting they received from many coastal communities, which were afraid of the turmoil of war approaching their borders. Nicias asserted that this lack of backing demonstrated the campaign's ineffectiveness. Alcibiades responded by proposing a diplomatic love-bombing campaign throughout Sicily. An ancient professional soldier named Lamachos had a third idea. He would just sail to Syracuse and take control of the city. But in the end, he took Alcibiades' side, and negotiations started. At the same time, the Syracuse administration was debating how to respond to the Athenian assault, while his colleague, Athenagoras, believed that dread of the Athenians was unfounded. General Homocrates advocated for surrender and insisted that an alliance be formed against Athens. As this was going on, Athens marched southward, acquiring allies along the Sicilian coast, such as the city of Naxos, before arriving in Messenia, a town that gave them access to their land and led them to camp in Catana. A trireme from Athens came at this time, requesting that Alcibiades come back so he might stand trial for the sacrilege. Alcibiades consented to come back, but he vanished inexplicably when they were traveling through the Athenian colony of Thurii. He reappeared and headed toward the Peloponnese when the ship departed without him. As a result, Nicias was left in charge of the Athenian army in Sicily de facto, overseeing a plan that he disagreed with, but that his soldiers insisted he stick with. Nicias came up with a clever strategy, since he did not want to confront Syracuse's overwhelming cavalry. To prove that the Athenians had kept their weapons out of sight of their camp, Alexander sent a covert agent. After enthusiastically accepting the tale, Syracuse departed the city. The Athenians and their allies secretly landed just outside the city at daybreak and positioned themselves between the sea and the hills that protected the temple of Zeus and the shoreline. They constructed a strong stockade there. Only after they reached Catana and discovered the Athenian army there deserted did the Syracusans recognize their error. Athens had the upper hand and was in a position that the Syracusan cavalry could not reach by the time the Syracusans had fled. The very following day, the armies battled. With their other allies on the left, and the Argives and Mantineans on the right, close to the coast, the Athenians positioned their own forces in the middle. With the cavalry on its right, the Syracusan army was around the same size. The Syracusans were taken aback when the Athenians rushed first, but the locals were able to defend themselves. Despite the fierce battle, the Argives' exceptional thrust caused Syracuse's left flank to start to lose ground. The Syracusans then fled as Athens moved out from their center. However, the Athenians did not pursue further because they had to remain in a small area where the enemy cavalry could not breach their fortifications. They could no longer transform their win into a rout because of the Athenians' weaker cavalry. As Athens broke the bridge to the main city of Syracuse, the Syracusans headed for the route to Heliopus. Athens lost 50 soldiers and seemed well positioned to pose a danger to the city, while Syracuse lost 200 troops. Following the fight, the Syracusans positioned themselves on the Athenian army's left flank on the hill of the Temple of Zeus. Then, being careful not to launch an immediate attack on the city, Nicias withdrew to Catania for the winter. Syracuse had survived Athens's first assault, but a torturous siege was to come. In the meanwhile, Corinth agreed to deploy troops to Syracuse when they dispatched envoys. After that, the envoys relocated to Sparta. Concurrently, Alcibiades had reached Sparta and was frightening them with alleged Athens' intentions to conquer Sicily and Carthage in order to establish a so-called United States of Force, to lead a rescue expedition to Sicily. Sparta dispatched Gylippus, a Mothax, a half-Helot, half-Spartan. In addition to Gylippus' army of 700 armed sailors, 1,000 hoplites, 1,000 native Sika warriors, and 100 cavalry. The reinforcements moving into Syracuse totaled 66,000 hoplites, 200 cavalry, and 100 triremes. The siege was initiated at Athens in the spring of 14 BCE. They traveled to the Leon coast via sea. After that, they marched through the pass of Euryalus and came against an army that Syracuse had dispatched to take control of the hills. Despite a battle, the Syracusans were unable to repel the Athenian invasion. After relocating to the city, Athens began enforcing its long-standing blockade tactic by erecting fortifications from Laon to the Great Harbor in Syracuse. At Sika, at the southern heights, and Lapidulum, at the western heights, 2 forts were built. The Syracusans rushed out to stop these stockades from being built, but they were unable to stand in a line and had to retreat. To isolate Athens from the southwest, Syracuse constructed its own wall. After waiting while the wooden wall was being constructed, Athens retaliated by sending 300 hoplites and well-armored light infantry to seize an outpost close to the wall, forcing the garrison that was defending it to evacuate. However, Syracuse persisted in constructing their wall, stretching it over a swamp close to the Great Harbor. In an attempt to retaliate, Athens divided the Syracusan army in two, one oriented toward the Anapus River on the left and one toward the city on the right. After moving behind the left flank, the 300 hoplites were overrun by the Syracusan cavalry, who then launched an attack on the Athenian right. Old man Lamachos lost his life in the combat, and both wings were thoroughly destroyed. Only after the majority of the Athenian army arrived did Syracuse pull back. Previously evacuating Syracusan forces reappeared and reorganized from the city. Others rushed to engage the Athenians, and a gallant Gylippus and a gallant Gallipus came to the rescue. While a Corinthian boat, led by Gonilus, snuck past the Athenians, he landed in Himera, where the inhabitants welcomed him as a savior. He then marched towards Syracuse. On the northern heights close to Epipolae, Gylippus saw a hole that Nicias had neglected to seal and had slid through. Gylippus set up camp outside the city when Nicias declined to participate. He captured Lapidulum the next day, enabling Syracuse to construct. In retaliation, Nicias traveled to Plumerium, which was the location of the Athenian naval at the southern entrance to the Great Harbor. In the northern heights, Gagilius was fought and defeated by Athens. Gagilius fought away from the fortifications, using this as a diversion. He routed the Athenian left flank with the help of javelin throwers and Syracusan cavalry. He then prevented Athens from blockading by extending his own wall. As additional ships were able to escape the blockade, Athens' morale started to decline. Syracuse dispatched envoys for further forces, while Gylippus departed to gather more supporters in Sicily. Athens dispatched another army led by Eurymedon and Demosthenes of Pylos, renowned in response to Nicias' request for more assistance. By April, there were 200 to 300 troops in the Sicilian rescue army and 2,000 hoplites in the Peloponnesian relief force, 250 Athenian cavalry, 30 mounted archers, 400 Sicilian mercenary cavalry, 5,000 hoplites, and 73 triremes were sent to Athens. Gylippus ordered Syracuse to assault the Athenian fleet, but they were unable to do so because their own navy divided into 45 triremes from the Little Harbor to the east and 35 triremes from the Great Harbor. Athens sent out 35 ships to fight the latter and 25 ships to fight the former. The unruly Syracusans were annihilated in an unwise pursuit into that bottleneck, although initially both Athenian armies were compelled to retire into the port. Gylippus was able to capture the 3 forts at Pomerium on land because of the maritime battle's diversion. Heracles had now imprisoned Athens like a Nemean lion inside his arms, preventing them from obtaining supplies from the outside, while the surviving ships of Syracuse launched ramming attacks against their navy. With little space, Athens lost a lot of ships. The defenders had forced the Athenian ships completely out of their harbor after a day's respite. At this point, Demosthenes arrived and hurried to Epiphylia, perhaps to the jubilation of the Athenians, who must have seen him as a bright savior. Demosthenes first captured the Syracusan counterwall in an attempt to invade Epiphylia at night. But once the people gathered, they were able to drive the Athenians out. The army's freshly discovered confidence was destroyed as the retreat descended into chaos. The dire-ness of their predicament was confronted by the Athenian generals. Now, the moderate Demosthenes wanted to go back to Athens, but Nicias dubiously said he knew Syracusan moles who would be prepared to give the city over to them. The army stayed after considerable debate. But as soon as they decided on this, Gylippus came back with his forces, which made Nicias reconsider and talk of retreating. Gaia was hiding Selene from her brother Helios when a moon eclipse happened, just as they were ready to leave. The soothsayers saw this as a terrible sign and insisted that the troops hold off on deploying for 27 days. In order to give their adversaries time to blockade them, the army chose to wait for almost a month. Like Achaeus, many of the more superstitious folk backed them. Syracuse rushed and breached the Athenian defenses just before the Athenians attempted to depart. The following day, 76 Syracusan ships outran the Ionian invaders in the attack by sailing out to meet 86 Athenian reaction ships. The sailors were saved by Athens, which was a bittersweet relief. Syracuse effectively besieged Athens from within by blocking the large harbor. In order to protect themselves, Athens constructed a second wall. If they were unable to flee by sea, they would march to their closest ally. Athens attempted, but was unable to apply force by penetrating the enemy's forces with their big ships. The region was teeming with enemy villages and Syracusan cavalrymen. Therefore, it was time to depart via land, which was dangerous. Additionally, Syracuse used guards to block all easily accessible overland routes. The battle's 40,000 survivors, led by Demosthenes and led by Nicias, headed off 2 days after the sea was lost. The following day, they established themselves in populated territory after marching over Anapus and setting up camp on a hill. They made 2 tries on 2 successive days to push through the Acrean cliff, but on the 3rd day, they discovered it was obstructed. With supplies now running low, they fought again and managed to break through on the 5th day, but only for a short distance. Nicias and Demosthenes attempted to march somewhere else as darkness fell, and Selene rode off to Endymion in her chariot. Gela, or Camarina, was their new destination. The 2 troops were divided at the conclusion of the night march, and Demosthenes lost command of his part, which dispersed. The Syracusans captured him the following day, encircling his army and using javelins to carpet bomb them until Demosthenes and his 6,000 survivors gave up. When Nicias and his army arrived to the river Erinyes, they positioned themselves on high ground. After a while, Syracuse came up to them, and Nicias discovered that everyone else had given up. For a full day, the Syracusans barraged them with javelins as Nicias attempted to buy his way out. There was a plot to escape at night, but it was found and stopped. The Athenians proceeded to the river Asinaris the following day when they were ambushed while attempting to obtain water. Nicias attempted to give himself up to Gylippus, but the Syracusans persisted in their slaughter. They caught the few survivors. The moderate and the extremist Nicias and Demosthenes were ultimately put to death. The majority of the few survivors would never again see their homes. Under appalling conditions, they would be compelled to perform physical labor at a quarry. Athens' expeditionary force was defeated, and its dignity devastated as the sun sank on that tragic day. Athena, the patroness of both towns, is shown crying, while the spirit of Orpheus plays a ballad to her. We may even see in Athens and a Syracusan mother weeping in front of their sons' hecatombs and condemning the people who brought them here. They suffered a huge defeat because, like many other countries before, and subsequently, they overcommitted and were preoccupied with their imperial ambitions. Regarding this campaign, Thucydides said, "It was the most glorious for the victorious and the most disastrous for the defeated. It was the greatest action of all those that occurred during the war, and it seems to me at least the greatest of any which we know to have happened to any of the Greeks." But the conflict had not ended. Athens' political unrest was about to erupt, and the second phase of the conflict had not yet begun. From the Hellespont to the islands of Crete, the battle will resurface throughout Greece. The King of Kings was thinking about getting involved in the geopolitical game in the area of Uhuras and Hyazadas to the east, and we still don't know what will happen to Alcibiades. It is a good idea to think about how war impacts those who are caught in its clutches while we speculate about what will transpire and navigate the immense complexity of the campaign. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, a companion of Pericles and a forerunner to Thucydides in the art of history, best summarizes this by reminding us that no one should be so foolish as to choose war to peace, in which fathers bury their sons instead of sons burial their fathers. Athens was completely destroyed when the triremes from her Sicilian invasion were dumped into the Mediterranean Sea. The citizens of Athens were incensed at the pro-war leaders who had brought this catastrophe upon their city, since thousands of people of working and combating age had perished in that futile effort. Alcibiades, the arch-traitor, had suggested to Sparta during the war that they should seize Decelea in Attica and erect walls to starve the populace. Because the Spartan walls restricted access, the silver mines, and Athens' rich agricultural hinterlands saw a decline in income. Athens was weaker than ever on the pan-Hellenic stage, and she had never had such poor influence over her vassals and friends. Sparta, meantime, had benefited from Athens' humiliation, and its pro-war camp was becoming more powerful and well-liked. Even Sparta's new allies in Syracuse were unable to change the tide of the weapons competition in the Aegean Sea, where Athens remained the dominating naval power despite its weakness. In order to make up for this serious deficiency, Sparta swallowed its pride and requested financial support from Achaemenid Persia, whom they typically detested. Like his predecessor Xerxes 2 generations before, the King of Kings most likely no longer hoped to subjugate all of Hellas. Nevertheless, he believed that the Achaemenids would be able to reach the Hellespont's vital maritime channel by upsetting Athens. Because Persia could offer financial backing Sparta, and Persia were a match forged in Zeus's and Ahura Mazda's heaven. Thucydides said that both sides' preemptive escalations marked the start of the second phase of the conflict, just as they had the first. In order to establish a strategic position for managing commerce and supplies from the north, King Agis set out to establish a Spartan colony in Heraclea. Delegations from a number of insurgent cities under Athenian control also sought support against their Ionian overlord. The Spartans followed Alcibiades' advice to gradually form alliances with Athens' island allies, including Chios. Under pressure, after being accused of having a child with King Pleistoanax's wife, he himself suggested forming an alliance with Tissaphernes, a local satrap in Ionia, in order to have a base outside of Sparta and make an escape. This collaboration worked out well because Tissaphernes acted as a mediator when Miletus opposed Athens. In response, Athens established a base of operations in the insurgent region and dispatched ships. As King Agis got irritated with Alcibiades' presence, he became more and more terrified of losing his privileged status in Sparta. The turncoat fled to Tissaphernes, who was becoming uneasy over the Spartan rejection of the pact, after the Spartan commander Astilokos was instructed to assassinate Alcibiades, escalating tensions. By starting discussions with the Athenian upper classes, who had become suspicious of their city's democratic systems, Alcibiades then reached out to the leaders of his former motherland in order to gain the support of the Athenian oligarchs. Alcibiades pledged to provide money from Persia, which the financially strapped Athenians needed. The word of the arrival of Persian wealth was disseminated by Alcibiades' emissaries, who sealed the transaction. Some of the generals and the Athenian warriors at Samos appeared to be interested in the concept. Alcibiades aimed to garner sufficient backing to launch a twin coup in Samos and Athens. Alcibiades was viewed by certain generals, like as Thrasybulus, as a potential remedy for the ongoing political unrest in Athens, even if they were professed Democrats. Some, like as Phrynichus, were opposed to his homecoming and insisted that Persia had no interest in the Athenians. He was worried, but he was powerless to stop Alcibiades from carrying out his intentions. The conspirators took control of the situation on June 9th, 4th, the 14th day of the Attic month of Thargelion. The local uprising was put down in Samos, but the coup in Athens was successful, and the dictatorship of the 400 party that almost instantly split into moderate and radical factions was created. The moderates, who had accepted Alcibiades' scheme only to obtain Persian funds to fight Sparta, were incensed when the extreme oligarchs started negotiating with Sparta. The moderate council of the 5,000 was eventually formed when the radicals were overthrown in yet another coup. A portion of Sparta's fleet was sent to Eritrea in April. Because of their connections to the Athenian oligarchs, Athens thought they were on their way to Athens. As soon as the Athenians understood where the Spartans were heading, they left for Evia, a crucial Athens granary. Working closely with their Boeotian allies, the Spartans sought Oropos as a secure port to conquer the island. A total of 36 ships were in the force. After Athens manned its surviving ships, followed the Peloponnesians, and then reunited with their strong Eretrian allies in the area, the Athenian sailors landed in Eretria and then went off to get provisions. They had no idea that they were about to be betrayed, since Eretria was now working with the Spartans. The Athenians would have to go outside the city to get food, since the Eretrians had planned to empty the market where they would buy in an attempt to undermine their Athenian friends. Then the Eretrian contingent issued a signal, maybe a walking Egyptian dance motion, and the Spartans stepped in. The Spartan commander, Agisandrides, set sail toward the city right away to fight the Athenians at sea. The Athenians weighed anchor and ran to their ships. The Athenians were restricted to the coast after being forced to retire from the battle at sea. But bad news was on the way, as the Eretrians slaughtered a large number of the soldiers in support of the Spartans. The crews of 22 Athenian ships were either murdered or captured. With the exception of Aureus, the whole island rose up in rebellion, signaling the end of Athenian dominance on Evia. Sparta quickly seized control of the island, depriving Athens of one of its most important breadbaskets. Now, in disarray, the Athenian naval at Samos, an ally of Athens and a bastion of democracy, aimed to bring democracy back to Athens. Because of his prior reconciliation with them and his pledges to support them, they asked Alcibiades to head the army, even though they viewed him as a traitor. We have to bid farewell to Thucydides the historian, whose writings have been essential to our ability to document the conflict. Given that he most likely passed away in April before finishing his masterpiece, his narrative ends somewhat abruptly here. Scholars still argue about his true personality and beliefs, but his writings demonstrated a deep realism and a sharp awareness of the pain that comes with conflict. We shall now concentrate on sources written by later authors like Plutarch or Xenophon. Athens's moderate aristocracy now aimed to import grain from the Hellespont, their other breadbasket. They were able to achieve some success in the Hellespont, the first of which occurred in April at Cynossema. The local satrap, Tisiphone, had not paid the Peloponnesian navy, which was based at Miletus, on time. Meanwhile, the 73-ship fleet under Mindaros started to go north, as the Hellespont satrap Pharnabazos asked for their help. After halting in Icarus, owing to a storm, they proceeded to Chios. When the Spartans stopped the 55-ship Athenian fleet at Samos under the command of Thrasylos, marched north in retaliation, and besieged a city on Lesbos. He was later joined by a certain Thrasybulus, and the number of ships rose to 67. At Rhoetium, the Peloponnesians advanced and touched down at the Hellespont. Additionally, Sparta had 16 ships at Abydos, and Athens had 18 ships in Sestos. Fearful of a trap, the tiny Athenian fleet managed to escape, but lost 4 ships. Meanwhile, Mindarus captured the little fleet and now had 80 ships. The Spartans at Abydos marched across their beach, as Athens, with 76 combined ships, proceeded slowly across the European portion of the Hellespont. The naval conflict started when the fleets formed a parallel formation across the straits. On the left was Thrasylos, while on the right was Thrasybulus. Mindaros started to march in an attempt to outflank the Athenians' right flank. While their left wing continued to advance up the Hellespont, the Athenians dispersed their right flank. The conflict turned land-based when the Peloponnesians' center shifted and forced the Athens center onto the ground. At sea, the Athenian wings persevered and defeated their adversaries who were attempting to rescue their fellows from the center. They liberated their companions on land after destroying the Peloponnesians' headquarters. Since the majority of Peloponnesian ships were able to escape, they had enough to fight another day. The Athenians were extremely thrilled because they were finally winning after a lengthy period of losing 15 ships and capturing 21. A while later, Abydos occurred. We are forced to rely on Diodorus and Xenophon, whose reports vary somewhat because this is the first fight mentioned after Thucydides concluded his narration. According to both stories, a Rhodesian man named Thoreus infiltrated the Hellespont. While assisting the Peloponnesians, was discovered by the Athenians and was either chased by the entire fleet of 74 ships or by a portion of it consisting of only 20 ships. After landing on shore at Rhoetium or Dardanus, the Rhodians, who according to Xenophon had 14 ships, were hunted down by the Athenians until Mindaros saw them and set off with his main fleet, of which Diodorus reported 84. Following a fight, Pharnabazo's prompt intervention was the only thing that kept the Peloponnesians from being forced into the coast. Thrasyllus had the left wing of the Athenians opposing the Syracusans, while Thrasybulus had the right wing against Mindaros. According to Xenophon, the combat lasted from the morning until the afternoon. The Peloponnesians then retreated to Abydos, when Alcibiades arrived with 18 or 20 ships. The Athenians, according to Diodorus, took 10 ships before being halted by a storm. By the time they reached the Peloponnesians, they had already landed and were unable to take any more ships. Xenophon states that the Athenians did take 30 ships during the land-based combat, in addition to their already seized ships. But he makes no mention of a storm. The fight was therefore a significant Athenian triumph. But despite their triumphs in Nosema and Abydos in April, they were still unable to establish complete dominance over the area. Sparta was receiving help from the Persian fleet to blockade the Hellespont. The Spartan admiral Mindaros gathered a fleet of ships from the whole Peloponnesian League, while the Persian satrap Pharnabazos commanded a sizable cavalry force that would prove crucial in the battle's land portion. According to Theodorus Siculus, this combined army had 80 ships, whereas Xenophon Alcibiades had 86 triremes and was similarly strong. The Athenians repositioned themselves north of Gallipoli in the Aegean to escape being imprisoned inside the Hellespont. The Spartan Navarchos, or naval chief Mindarus, was eager to besiege and conquer Cyzicus, a city close to Marmara's coasts. Together with his cavalry, the Persian satrap Pharnabazos swiftly compelled the city to submit. In order to conceal their actual arsenal from the enemy, the Athenians concealed in the city of Abydos when they arrived at the Hellespont. Xenophon and Diodorus Siculus give significantly different accounts of Athens's early intentions. Alcibiades led his squadron past the Peloponnesians, leading Mindarus to follow him, while the fleet waited for heavy rain to reach the city of Cyzicus, under the cover of the deluge, according to Xenophon. According to reports, Alcibiades started to land and Mindarus approached to follow suit. Mindarus is then said to have fled to a beach south of the town when Alcibiades allegedly turned the ships around and launched a surprise attack on him. The troops advanced to the coast and engaged in combat. Mindarus was killed in this battle, but Alcibiades prevailed. Everyone else was captured, and Syracuse burned its ships to escape. According to Diodorus, Athens divided into 3 groups in an attempt to ambush the enemy. Alcibiades commanded 20 ships into Cyzicus and was supposed to return to bait the Peloponnesians. After stealing their own ships and hiding, Theramenes and Thrasybulus attacked and blocked the Peloponnesians from the coast. But this did not turn out the way the Athenians had hoped. The Peloponnesians fled inland to Clary as Mindarus pursued Alcibiades, and the ambush was set off. They encountered the cavalry troops of Pharnabazus there. They destroyed several Peloponnesian ships in their pursuit of the Athenians, then seized the ships ashore with grappling harpoons. After then, the conflict shifted to the land. In an attempt to seize control of the remaining Peloponnesian fleet, Alcibiades and Mindarus encircled the ships and started fighting on land. According to Diodorus, the Athenians captured the whole Peloponnesian fleet in this battle, and Mindarus was slain. According to a Spartan telegraph home cited by Xenophon, the ships are gone, Mindarus has disappeared, the men are hungry, and we don't know what to do. Laconically states, the next days saw the fall of Cyzicus, which completely restored Athens' dominion over the Hellespont. Athenian morale was significantly raised by the series of decisive victories in the Hellespont. Now that they had secured their breadbasket on the Hellespont, the Athenians were in a good mood. The moderate aristocracy was eager to take advantage of this triumph, but not by engaging in more combat. Rather, they contemplated a peace agreement with Sparta, wherein they would cede Pylos and safeguard their other achievements in another location. But the Samian Democrats and the populace were not amenable. Although we don't know exactly how this happened, we may presume that Athens residents had some local support for bringing democracy back. We must also take into account the class analysis which was viewed as elitist by many Athens philosophers. It said that democracy reflected the power of even the lower classes of men who were not property owners, whereas the 5,000 only represented the classes of the wealthy and the Zeugatai. Little is known about the democratic movement at Athens, but we can see the general populace gradually warming to the notion of restoring control as their dread of the oligarchic anarchy and the Sicilian defeat set in. Once again, democracy was fully restored with the return of Alcibiades and the other generals from Samos. In an effort to combat tyranny, they halted the modification of previous democratic legislation and introduced the diobelia, or gift of 2 obols to all people. The 500 bullies were reinstated by the agora, albeit with restrictions on offenses and legal penalties. It was made rhetorically evident that Athens' democracy was back and prepared to defend its interests and ideals through the crucial use of the language of the first laws passed following the Restoration. Additionally, they made it unlawful to harm democracy. After a terrible campaign and political and economic turmoil, Athens had recovered. But the conflict was far from ended. The Athenian Empire was now attempting to maintain its newfound dominance in the Peloponnesian League. Through Sparta as a proxy and ally, Persia was now actively involved in the conflict. Alcibiades and other Athenian generals were prepared to carry on the second phase of the Peloponnesian War. Alcibiades and other old factional characters were back at it in a revitalized democracy. Many viewed him as a traitor and he was keen to use military victories to reclaim the city's favor and authority. Athens focused its military efforts on the Hellespont, where they aimed to expel Persian and Spartan influence and seize total control of the area. They rebuilt their navy in April and started getting ready for battle in those treacherous waters. At the same time, Sparta attempted to invade ally places such as Chalcedon, but these attempts were thwarted by Athenian patrols. After striking a contract with Pharnabazos to keep Chalcedon under control and engaging in diplomatic talks with Sparta's ally, the Shahensa of the Achaemenids, Athens was able to secure its hegemony over the Hellespont. Even though Sparta's situation was not ideal, they would soon turn things around thanks to palace intrigue in Persia. Arsacus the eldest of the two Achaemenid princes and Cyrus the second-born were fighting for the throne with the queen mother parasites supporting the latter. The odds were stacked against Cyrus, since Arses was the desired king, and he was opposed by several other relatives and strong satraps, including our old acquaintance Tisiphone. However, Cyrus outwitted them all with his mother's assistance and then tried to solidify his position by forming a safe alliance with Sparta. Our well-known Spartan Mothax Lysander made her second appearance in the Aegean as a navarch here in April. Lysander was eager to establish Sparta's interests in the Aegean, having succeeded the now-deceased Mindarus. The Perso-Spartan relationship needed to be strengthened because Athens was doing quite well in the area. Following their meeting at Sardis, Lysander and Cyrus decided to cooperate in their fight against Athens in Asia Minor. This offers a fascinating perspective on the geopolitics of this stage of the conflict. Despite sharing a similar adversary, Sparta and Persia's cooperation was not certain because of divergent political ideologies. Compromised if they had to relinquish control in Ionia and were reliant on Persia. Although we don't have any Persian sources, it's plausible that they were worried about Sparta becoming a regional rival to Athens. After using Persian money to raise the wages of its rowers, Sparta expanded her fleet from 70 to 90 by constructing 20 triremes at Ephesus. Alcibiades retaliated by capturing Lysander's hand and leading an Athenian navy to Notium. Lysander waited, refusing to fall for the ruse. Alcibiades eventually gave his second mate, Antiochus, leadership of his ships and abandoned his main fleet to visit neighboring Athenian garrisons. Antiochus was instructed not to engage in combat with Lysander, but Antiochus, being a quintessential Athens, disregarded the directives and launched a naval assault against the Spartans nevertheless. Here, the accounts of events provided by our main primary sources, Diodorus and Xenophon, differ. According to Diodorus, Antiochus led 10 ships directly to Ephesus, which prompted Lysander to withdraw his army, shoot Caio Antiochus's ship, and then start chasing the Athenians back to Notium. According to Xenophon, Antiochus sailed to the Spartans with just 2 ships in the port. Although Lysander initially sent just a small number of ships, it appears that Athens sent more, but the Spartan fleet was only let loose as a result of the reinforcements. Regardless, the Spartans routed Antiochus's advancing army before continuing on to Notium. In Notium, the Athenians rushed to their ships, set sail, and formed several small groups to engage in combat. In the end, 15 of the 22 ships were lost, demonstrating Sparta's numerical advantage. Lysander returned to Ephesus victorious. After the troops withdrew to Samos, Alcibiades returned there in complete disgrace. Alcibiades sent his whole fleet to Ephesus to offer combat in a final attempt to save his reputation. Nevertheless, Lysander stayed out of the way and declined to participate, understanding that doing so would put him at a disadvantage. The Athenians went back to Samos humiliated. The political career of Alcibiades ended at this point. He fled into self-exile in Thrace after the Athenian populace turned against him, following the destruction of his navy. He would spend the rest of his life until his death in April, making fruitless attempts to return to politics. How this occurred is unknown to us, but according to Plutarch, it occurred when he visited the Persian court to obtain support for Athens against Sparta. But his adversary Lysander had already dispatched emissaries to Pharnabazus to set up assassins to remove Alcibiades. Alcibiades chose to make his last stand when the assassins burned his home on fire. He was slain in the subsequent knife fight when he fled the burning building. This concludes the tale of the statesman, general, traitor, and traitor who chose to die a dignified death. Lysander was removed of his position in April. Callicratidas the Navarch, who replaced him in the admiralty, persisted in his attempts to expand his power inside the Athens-dominated region. This required circumnavigating the Ionian coast in an attempt to seize some of the local cities from Athens. In order to ensure he had a numerical edge, Callicratidas rallied 140 ships to his side before facing Conon, an Athenian admiral. The navy started to cruise down the coast and fight little engagements. The siege of Delphinium in April was the first. On the island of Chios, which had been among the first strongholds to revolt against Athens following the Syracuse fiasco, lay the Athenian outpost known as Delphinium. Athens was unable to reclaim Chios, but they were able to use the citadel to start a blockade of the island and maintain some semblance of authority over the area. And whole Peloponnesian fleet was now confronting a 500-strong Athenian force outside Delphinium that was attempting to capture a hostile island. They must have seen this personnel gap as soon as the fleet appeared, so they hoisted the white flag of surrender before the battle started. After releasing them to join the other Athenian soldiers, the Spartans went ahead and demolished the citadel. After this victory, Callicratidas proceeded to Methymne, another Athenian fortress with a much bigger garrison on the island of Lesbos. In an attempt to penetrate this citadel, Sparta sent waves of attacks, but they were all driven back. Eventually, however, Callicratidas penetrated portions of the walls, most likely the outer ones. Divergences within the post-Thucydidean historiographical environment are evident here. Diodorus Siculus claimed that the local Methymnians wanted the conflict to end. As a result, they let the Spartans to enter the city, betraying it to them. Xenophon only mentions a final successful attack and makes no mention of any such treachery. After that, the Peloponnesian fleet advanced and nearly caught the Athenian navy. Although several Athenian ships were taken, Conon the Athenian commander withdrew with his ships. Conon was in the area to aid the Methymnians, but after learning of the collapse of the city, he remained in Hector Ternesia, which is south of Adramyttium, which is east of Lesbos. At Samos, the Peloponnesians attempted to cut them off from their base. Conon, the Spartan, and Athenians escaped to Mytilene before daybreak. Following him, Callicratidas reached the city's harbor, which was a huge gulf area. The Athenian side lost 30 ships in the ensuing fight. Although the crews of most of them survived, Callicratidas encircled the city and imposed a protracted siege. Once more, our two historians give different versions of events. According to Xenophon, the city faced hunger as a result of a shortage of food. According to him, Conon attempted to use two of his ships to deliver a message to Athens asking for assistance. One ship was taken prisoner, and the other made it to the Hellespont before making its way to Athens. In contrast, Diodorus Siculus asserts that Conon started the first fight, and that the second combat in the harbor was fought after the siege started. Callicratidas caught 10 ships that were on their way from Samos to Athens. The inhabitants of Athens promptly started building a new fleet from all around their empire as soon as they learned of the siege of Mytilene. From Ionissae, a large number of ships were gathered from Athens, its Samian sidekicks, and other Aegean islands. Aristocrates, Aristogenes, Diomedon, Aracinides, Lysias, Pericles the Younger, the son of Pericles, and Aspasia Prodamachus and Thrasyllus were among the 8 best generals from Athens that fought. Under Conon, Athens also possessed 70 ships in the area, for a total of 155 ships with their reinforcements. There were already 140 ships at Sparta. Due to his growing confidence, Callicratidas brought 120 ships to confront the Athenian fighters. The remaining ships remained at Mytilene. After a rainstorm that the Greeks could only think Zeus himself sent, the Greek goddess of dawn Eos set her chariot forth for the new day, and the two armies were destined to meet. The biggest naval engagement of the Peloponnesian War took place on the western coast of the Ionissae Islands. 2 lines were formed by the Athenian navy. Pericles the Younger was immediately behind Aristocrates, who had 15 ships on the extreme left wing. Diomedon stood to their right, flanked by Aracinides and 15 ships. Athenian taxiarchs and navarchs in charge of the fleet were part of the center, along with Athens' obedient Aegean allies. Protimachus stood more to the right, followed by Lysias, each of whom had 15 ships. Aristogenes commanded the rear, while Thrasyllus led the first line on the periphery right wing. The Athenian right wing faced the coast, while the left wing was next to the open sea. Directly in front of the Ionese Islands, in the middle of the line, were the allies. This was a clever strategic strategy because the island behind them prevented any kind of stealth attack from encircling Athens, and the Spartans needed to stay nearby to avoid falling into the open sea. In response, Callicratidas divided his fleet, assigning the left wing to his Boeotian allies under Thrasindus the Theban and the right flank to himself. Being outnumbered this time, the Spartan admiral believed that Sparta was becoming more and more reliant on Persia. The ships collided on the shores of Ionissae after he made the decision to start the battle in order to get a short-term win that would give him the upper hand without Persian assistance. As the seas of Poseidon smashed and roiled against the island's beaches, the ships collided with one another. As they moved forward, the Athenians spread their ships wide, gaining complete command of the naval environment and filling in any openings to prevent the Spartans from moving between and encircling them. The fight lasted for a very long time, according to both of our sources. Thus, even with the numerical advantage, the Athenians did not win easily. Although various stories vary on how this occurred, Callicratidas met his demise on that fateful day after making his decision. We are aware that he struck the Athenians with his ship. Diodorus says he became entangled with Pericles the Younger's ships and fell while fighting, whereas Xenophon says he fell from the ship during the ramming and perished. In any event, Callicratidas lost his life defending his alliance against his adversaries. His comrades had reportedly warned him before the battle that they would have a hard time winning, so they had to call off the conflict. In response, he is believed to have said, "If I die in battle, Sparta will not suffer any harm. If I surrender, Sparta will suffer great shame, much like King Leonidas or Hector of the Trojans." Although our two primary sources cannot agree on whether it was the right or left side, one of the Spartan flanks eventually broke as well, indicating the start of the end. The Athenians were left behind, while the Peloponnesians escaped to Chios. Only 25 ships on the Athenian side were destroyed compared to 70 Spartan ships. A desperate Athenian state prevailed in this battle. Here we see Conan's fate when he was still under siege. In order to assist him get out of the blockade he was in, the generals divided their army, with 2/3 traveling to Mytilene and 1/3 remaining to aid their fellow soldiers at sea. While the other navarchs went to pursue the Spartans, 2 triarchs, Thucydides and Theramenes, were sent to attempt to rescue the surviving sailors. Due to the split naval forces and a massive storm that limited ship movements, Eteonicus, the Peloponnesian commander at Mytilene, evacuated his army and his fleet, allowing Conan to escape the blockaded city and connect with the main Athenian fleet. However, neither enough dead nor enough wounded were gathered. It was then, as bittersweet as the shade of Odysseus' mother, when they met in the gates of Hades, when word reached Athens. It infuriated the Athenians. The generals were aware that the Athenian arguments would resume while they watched the sunset at Ionusae. Following the combat, there was a very intense debate. Theramenes felt the generals had been too lengthy in pursuing the Spartans, while the generals blamed Theramenes for failing to save the drowning seamen. The former thought Theramenes was disparaging them, which was typical of Athens politics. As a result, they wrote a letter stating that the storm was to blame. Because the Athenians were furiously accusing them for the men's deaths, the generals believed that Theramenes had launched his own war against them. As a result, they wrote a second letter explaining that the captains had been ordered to gather the deceased, therefore absolving themselves of responsibility for the catastrophe. In addition to being effective speakers and politicians, Theramenes and Thucydides had a significant impact on ancient Athens. As a result, they started lobbying the agora, saying they were given an impossible task to complete. According to Diodorus, the generals were doomed when they declared these two to be foes, while 2 others, Aristogenes and Protomachos, sensed that there would be a biased trial against them and had left before coming. Aristogenes was imprisoned. This created a sense of remorse among the Athenians, further complicating matters for the surviving generals. Many people debated the advantages and disadvantages of their guilt in a contentious argument. Due to the intense emotional stakes involved in the case, the trial was hurried and lacked the customary legal process for which Athens was renowned. The 6 surviving generals and several lower-ranking officers were so convicted and put to death. Later, many Athenians began to regret their foolish practices and the harshness of the penalty they imposed. Additionally, Sparta offered peace on the conditions of the status quo. Well aware that Lysander, who was extremely strong, anxious to reclaim authority, brave, and morally unrestrained, would inevitably attempt to do so. Many politicians, especially one named Cleophon, believed they might gain total control over the Aegean, but Athens ultimately refused. At this point, the war's outcome was determined by the 3 destinies. Sparta was still allied with Persia, and Lysander was certain to return. Thus, the fight would inevitably go on. The last 2 years of the conflict, which will have a significant impact on Hellas's geopolitics, are drawing near. Both on land and at sea, the two coalitions will resolve their differences. Furthermore, much like they did against the Persians, the Athenians will have to defend their houses and battle the Spartans on their own territory. Only the Olympians know who will go to Tartarus and who will go to Elysium, and the battles will be fierce, and the stakes will be tremendous. Ahinousai and their Athenian adversary rejected their suggested peace agreement after the fact, despite the Athenian triumph. Since the Spartans would have to continue investing resources in the war, rather than regrouping with Persian assistance, it was imperative that they work with Persia once more. According to Donald Kagan, this was because their King of Kings had come to view the Peloponnesian conflict as a proxy war against the obnoxious Athens meddlers who were attempting to regain control of Athens. However, like Oedipus's parents' futility in trying to avoid their son Persia would eventually become involved. Lysander had gone to the Shahanshah's court to negotiate with the Persians, as we will remember from our last episode. He had also had discussions with several member states of the Peloponnesian League, many of which were Ionian towns afraid of an Athenian invasion of their territory. In order to convince their Spartan ringleaders to help them, the towns of the Peloponnesian League demanded a conference. Both the Persians and the Peloponnesian allies asked Lysander to return to his position as Naval Transport Supremo, or Navarch for short, during this conference, which was held at Ephesus. In April of 2006, Lysander built a fresh fleet of 35 ships and sailed from the Peloponnese to his own paradise Ephesus. With a substantial amount of Persian currency that was worthy of Midas's own golden touch, Lysander had the money needed to start the Peloponnesian fleet's rearmament operation. Additionally, he was able to win over villages like Miletos, where Callicrates, his competitor and predecessor, had attempted to dismantle his power circles by using threats and violence. After moving to Caria, which had sided with Athens in April, Lysander massacred its males and sold its women into slavery. He then turned his attention to the Hellespont, the strategic chokehold that had been the subject of years of conflict. The destiny of the Hellenic city-states would be determined in these narrow passageways where the Argonauts were unable to be stopped by the clashing rocks on their way to Colchis. The Athenians had chosen to establish a base in the Hellespont after spending the most of the year upgrading their navy. Alcibiades, who had been banished there and was now still alive, had visited to inspect it and pronounced its defenses insufficient. He asserted that prior Hellespont conflicts had made clear the significance of ground soldiers in this circumstance. He also asserted that Athens would be better served by establishing a base at Sestos and enlisting the aid of the neighboring Thracian monarchs. After a storm, Lysander captured the city and was now based there. The Athenian generals in charge at the Hellespont, Conon Philocles and Adeimantus, however, turned down his offer because they thought it was unrealistic and would have rather been near Lysander and possible reinforcements. With a total of 170 ships, Lysander and his Spartan ally Arachis had successfully restored his army and navy to their most fearsome size and form to date. His adversaries, however, had a force that was just as strong, since Athens had 180 ships and about 36,000 troops. The Athenians first left Agorapetmi and traveled outside of Lampsacus. A line of ships was assembled there, prepared to take on the powerful Lysander. But the Spartans hesitated to come out and battle just as Odysseus avoided Polyphemus's eyes. The Athenians retreated as they became weary of the wait. As Lysander meticulously collected intelligence with his swift scout ships, the routine of visiting the location and futilely waiting for his counterattack continued for days. Eventually, the Delian League grew increasingly irresponsible. As it did, Lysander seized the opportunity and executed his pivotal move. On the origins of this, however, our sources diverge. According to Diodorus, the Athenian generals took turns going out and attempting to entice Lysander every day. The commander-in-command, Philocles, went out with 30 triremes on the 6th day, but he believed it was insufficient. In order to separate the squadron that was supposed to attack Lysander, he issued a call back to base, asking the other ships to follow him. Although it has been hypothesized that this action may have been a diversionary strategy or a plot to entice the Spartans to Sestos and defeat them, we are unsure of the rationale behind it. In any event, Lysander learned of this from some deserters and promptly began pursuing the split fleet, capturing each squadron individually. The triremes clashed when he first saw Philocles' flagship. The Spartan Mothax won this battle quickly and is said to have advanced toward the Hellespont's European coasts. There he encountered the unprepared Athenians and anchored his ships. According to Xenophon, Athens was in a vulnerable position since they had to travel great distances to get supplies. Thus, Lysander's spies noticed the Athenians searching for food on the 5th day and recognized a great chance to attack. Like Perseus pursuing Medusa, they brandished a shield to call for the Peloponnesians to approach. Here, our sources come together as Lysander starts the carnage. The Spartan surged past the ships that Athens dispatched to delay him. He then gave the order for his troops to secure the ships that were on the coast, and they were able to seize the majority of them. Conan's ships were not among them. When the slaughter started, he captured 9 Spartan ships and fled. The soldiers soon landed as well and started pursuing the Athenians. The Peloponnesian allies exacted their gory revenge after years of Athens' raids, with the exception of a general named Adamantos, who was either a traitor or the most amenable to compromise with Sparta. 3,000 Athenians were slaughtered. Conan the deserter escaped to Cyprus. When a trireme known as the Paralis came in Piraeus' harbor, Athens learned of the loss. The populace attempted to prepare for the impending siege by gathering food and weapons. Given the lack of an expensive navy and the imminence of Sparta's might, a siege of Athens seemed inevitable. By eliminating several city-states that were Athens' allies, Lysander had started to undermine Athenian authority over the Hellespont and its bountiful grain fields. In addition, he freed the troops to return to their hometown, took Sestos, an Athenian stronghold, and forewarned the Athenians of what was ahead. The army started to encircle Athens on the Decelea location, where the Spartans had moved in with King Agis. Pausanias, the other Spartan ruler, concentrated on mobilizing Sparta's Peloponnesian allies to muster their forces and ultimately overrun Athens. By the time Lysander assembled 200 ships and established a blockade of Piraeus, the trap was completely closed. The siege had started, and Athens was now cut off from both land and sea. The Athenians were determined to resist knowing what had happened when the prisoners were put to death at Agospotamisae by the Peloponnesian allies. Time was not on their side, though, as their supply reserves quickly started to run low. When Lysander departed for Samos, where radical Democrats were still at large, and Pausanias went for the Peloponnese. For unknown reasons, the pressure on their necks was somewhat relieved. Some ships that were left behind by the latter were able to keep the blockade in place. The Athenians dispatched an embassy under Theramenes to King Agis, who was still in Decelea, knowing that their time was running short. Even though the Peloponnese's supporters called for the whole destruction of Athens, Agis rejected their ruthless demand and gave the proposition made to him by the Athenian ambassador some thought. Because they were permitted to preserve their city walls, Athens agreed to join the Spartan alliance and submit to Sparta. The Athenians were infuriated and placed in a militarily isolated position when the Spartan ephors turned down this offer. Even the lengthy walls were debatable according to certain Athenians, like Archestratus, who advised them to accept further talks. However, the Athenians were terrified that Sparta would do to them what Athens did to Melos, so they imprisoned him. Cleophon and other non-capitulators, on the other hand, approved a vote prohibiting any more talks with the enemy. But as famine spread across the city, the Athenians eventually found themselves in a position where they had to negotiate. Their minds went to Lysander to negotiate. He argued that the terms of the discussions should not be placed in the hands of the rising Thebans. Additionally, he was able to persuade the politically unstable Spartan Maphax to grant Athens significant constitutional authority. Theramenes persuaded Lysander that a moderate oligarchy with a more expansive franchise based on income would be a better option than imposing a strict oligarchy with limited franchise on the agora. This would be sufficient to restrain the unpredictable politics and audacious foreign policy escapades of Athenian democracy. As a result, a severe but somewhat less cruel peace was reached in spite of Corinth and Thebes' adamant requests to demolish the city. Sparta believed that Athens deserved both attention and pity because of their previous services during the Persian invasions decades prior. As a result, the blockade was eventually removed, and the Peloponnesian army accepted Athens' submission. Though modest in comparison to the concepts of retribution in Thebes and Corinth, Sparta's demands were precise and targeted, and they must have been extremely humiliating to the arrogant Athenians, particularly when they had to witness Lysander fall into Piraeus and tear down the walls. Athens was to be completely integrated into the Spartan system of alliances and area of influence while maintaining its independence. Since any of the city's factions may view it as a preservation of their democracy, Theramenes was able to persuade Athens to accept the bargain by allowing the Athenians to retain the Patrios Politeia, or Old Constitution. Additionally, Athens's fleet was to be whittled down to 12 vessels. In addition, city exiles were expected to return and assimilate into Athens. Although we don't know what the Athenians thought of this arrangement, we do know that Theramenes utilized his relationship with the Spartans to establish himself as one of the 30 tyrants, a brief dictatorship that seized power in Athens at the request of Sparta following the end of the war. By tearing down the democratic statutes in the royal stoa of the Athenian agora, these 30 tyrants established a reign of terror and were eager to suppress the opposition. Because Critias was so ruthless, many people hated the new regime. Since the tyrant's reign was short, about a year, Athens' history of dissent and uprising arose once more. Many Democrats eventually revolted from exile and battled vehemently until they restored the legendary Athenian democracy, including Thrasybulus, a triarch. The start of this civil war, which we name the Philae campaign, was as follows. The 30 tyrants had only given the so-called 3,000 the right to vote and had started attacking Democrats and medics. Thus, Thrasybulus, whose fame in the Peloponnesian War had made him popular with loyalists, became the center of a constant stream of exiles in Thebes. Together with his ally, Anytos, Thrasybulus was committed to figuring out how to bring democracy back to Athens. As a result, the two of them marched into Athenian territory in the fort of Philae with just 70 faithful Democrats, like Athenian counterparts of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. The dictators started organizing the 3,000 because they were concerned that the democratic force would invade their region so swiftly and attract subversive activities. In an attempt to capture the castle, the vanguard force marched up into Philae and made camp outside. A portion of the tyrant's army launched an opening attack, which the rebels quickly repulsed. After arriving later, the 30 tyrants started making siege preparations. They got caught in a snowstorm, though, and this was all taking place in April. The tyrannical troops were forced to flee when the courageous Democrats successfully sent out a portion of their army to annoy them. The tyrants then called forth the Spartan contingent at Athens under Colobius, and they marched out with them and 2 Athenian cavalry divisions. They located a fort close to Philae and started obstructing the Democrats' access to agricultural land. Meanwhile, Thrasybulus was determined to maintain his lead, and his troop was growing now, numbering 700 men. They arrived to the Spartan tyrant fort after departing the castle at dusk. They attacked the fort as the men were waking up in the morning. Many Spartans were murdered when they were taken by surprise. The remaining Athenian cavalry escaped with them. A triumphant Thrasybulus returned to Philae after erecting a trophy at the location. The 30 were starting to feel nervous. Thrasybulus now had 1,000 soldiers, and the uprising was growing stronger. He chastised them when they attempted to persuade him to join their ranks and become black. A doctor was also prepared by the 30. The renowned Eleusinian mysteries took place in an evil-style underground bunker in the Eleusinian village. For his part, Thrasybulus was becoming more ambitious. Democrats were aware that many of them were deported to Piraeus, the well-known port of Athens, which was suddenly undefended after the ancient walls were demolished. The port was the perfect place for radical democracy to take root and restore the noble polity because of its cosmopolitanism and low-wage working population. The battlefield for the Battle of Munichia was thus prepared. Diodorus and Xenophon provide us various versions of the battle's preamble in this instance, as is customary. According to Diodorus, the 30 camped themselves in a fort at Achone, close to Piraeus, but were discovered and routed by the advancing Democrats, forcing them to flee. The Democrats took control of the port at night for Xenophon, and chose to march away after determining that defending the city would leave them too dispersed. In both instances, the conflict started when they established their positions on the hill of Munichia, close to Piraeus. Since there isn't much in Diodorus's report, we shall concentrate on Xenophon's. As it transpired, the tyrants marched up the hill after forming a line of 50 ranks at a hippodamus market. With the light infantry and spear throwers in the rear lines, the Democrats were 10 ranks deep. Since his seer had warned him not to move until he or Thrasybulus were dead or injured, Thrasybulus ordered the tyrants to stop attacking as they started to ascend the hill. Thrasybulus ordered a rush down the hill, after the seer was soon attacked and forced into the Elysium fields. Two of the tyrants, Critias and Hippomachus, were killed when the attack penetrated the oligarchic defenses and advanced. Following the fight, the 3,000 overthrew the 30 and replaced them with a council of 10, one from each tribe. Of the 30, only 2 were present at the council. The others fled to Eleusis. Since both governments had dispatched emissaries, Sparta was frantically trying to get control of the situation and was torn between acknowledging the 30 and the 10 as genuine governments. Pausanias, one of the 2 monarchs, and Lysander, who had organized the 30, were the 2 main contenders for power. Lysander started mobilizing with the 30 after being designated Harmost and traveling to Eleusis. Later, 3 of the 5 ephos of Sparta agreed to give Pausanias a contingent of diverse Peloponnesian soldiers. Thebes and Corinth declined to send troops because they were afraid Sparta would grow too strong. Lysander, who was complaining, had to accompany Pausanias when he reached Attica. The Spartans positioned themselves outside of Lysander on the left, Pausanias on the right, and Piraeus. Pausanias made the first diplomatic effort by requesting that the rebels disband. He attacked, undermined their defenses, and then withdrew once this was criticized. The Democrats launched raids to attempt to stop him when he went on reconnaissance the following day to determine whether a siege wall was feasible. After driving them back with his hoplites and killing 30 of them, Pausanias pursued the remaining ones into Piraeus. The last Democratic forces were armed and preparing there. They killed some of the leaders, including Olympic champion Lacrates, and succeeded in driving the Spartans back. Thrasybulus organized his hoplites into 8 ranks and started to advance. Pausanias pulled back and unified his army. He advanced on the Democrats, who decided to make a final stand, forming a much deeper formation. Despite their heroic efforts, the Democrats were defeated and had to withdraw. In total, they had lost 150 soldiers compared to just 13 Spartans. Since Pausanias was a defensive foreign policy guy, he extended his offer of diplomacy once again. In Sparta, a negotiated solution was reached. Democracy was restored, and everyone save the 30 tyrants and their most heinous accomplices were promised a general amnesty. Both the Democrats and the 10 sent emissaries there. At Eleusis, the last tyrants attempted to form a mercenary army, but were apprehended, and the Democrats launched an attack that permanently crushed the authoritarians. Following Lysander's sycophancy, Pausanias was prosecuted for his crimes, but found not guilty. Sparta was now the unchallenged great powerhouse of Hellas, but this would not last long, even though Athens had managed to maintain her political identity. The constitution of Sparta was appropriate for a remote nation in need of social cohesion. It wasn't fit for managing a vast empire. Thebes and Corinth were among the several allies that soon started to secede. In an attempt to restore its reputation as the champions of the Hellenic world, which had been damaged by their alliance with Persia, Sparta quickly started to terrify new kingdoms like Aeolus in an effort to keep its position as the dominant power. As a result, Sparta launched an offensive in Asia Minor under the reign of King Agesilaus. As has been the case throughout the latter years of the Peloponnesian War, Thebes finally became a powerful city and spread its influence throughout Hellas. Ironically, the Achaemenid Empire assisted the 4 unusual allies Thebes, Argos, Athens, and Corinth in their March battle against the Spartans, which ended in a standoff. After this, though, Athens reclaimed its lengthy fortifications and rose to prominence once more, but not as an empire as before. This was a temporary triumph, but Thebes would go on to create its own little empire. The Argead dynasty would soon rise from the northern plains of Macedon and become a pan-Hellenic superpower via much more careful diplomacy. Ironically, this kingdom, which the rest of Hellas saw as backwater and barbarous, became the leader of Hellas. However, the Peloponnesian War had a terrible impact on Greece's city-states overall, demonstrating how unpredictable events can be. Athens and Megara, for example, suffered significant losses in agricultural production and revenue. Cities like Corinth had far less soldiers for their hoplite balances in the future because to devastating combat losses. But they were nothing in comparison to places like Plataea and Melos, where whole populations were enslaved and killed. As the three destinies woven and severed the lines of many lives we might envision, Athena and Ares battling over the futures of the towns. War is a brutal thing, and it was especially so in ancient Greece. As oligarchs and democrats engaged in frequent battles in Greek cities, a kind of covert factionalism developed throughout the country. The Peloponnesian War's geopolitical lessons have been discussed by academics. Some have drawn attention to civil war, which frequently formed or broke cities, particularly in the case of Athens, where everything was up for dispute. As a result, some contemporary analysts have questioned the effectiveness of democracies in times of conflict. Others counter this critique by pointing out that Athens survived and even prospered despite suffering significant defeats like Syracuse and even after losing the war. In any case, the Peloponnesian War, with its erratic alliances, bloody conflicts, and epic souvlaki and heroes' cook-offs between ephors and strategy, has become a classic study in geopolitics. The historian, whose sources we have largely consulted, Thucydides, has established an amazing reputation as a meticulous and scientific historian. His intention to turn the battle into a perpetual possession, or katame, essay, has shaped history and our understanding of combat. Classicists, historians, and political scientists continue to argue about his realpolitik beliefs and whether he advocated for a global order that would prevent the excesses of war, or whether he preferred realism in geopolitics. With historians like Sima Qian ibn Khaldun and Garcilaso de la Vega el Inca, we may say that he has earned a place among the greats of history. Thus, the Peloponnesian War concludes as a rock lifted by Sisyphus, only to fall again, rather than as an Odyssean homecoming to Ithaca or a Dionysian return from India. During this time, tragic poets such as Euripides made observations about the nature of war and the ways in which the Olympians sparked conflicts. In this retelling of the Iliad's narrative, with its aristocratic values, the Olympians, not Helen of Troy, were responsible for the Trojan War. They killed thousands of people and blamed her forever while she was abducted in Egypt by using a cloud eidolon of her. In actuality, Thucydides appears to have had a theistic view of war and peace, and the conflict was a geopolitical event with many implications for modern times. However, we might want to close this movie with two observations. The first is from Euripides' tragic play Helen, where he writes, "How varied is the character of God, say, how incomprehensible, from minute to minute they alter mortals' fates, from favorable to unfavorable. The fate of any individual is uncertain. In his poem, Helen, which was inspired by Euripides' play, the contemporary Greek poet George Sepphoris states that Scamander will not be able to hear from messengers who come to inform him that all of this agony and all of these lives were sent to the abyss for an empty shirt for a Helen. And thus our tale comes to a conclusion. Make sure to subscribe and click the bell icon to receive future videos about ancient Greek combat. Creating these long videos takes a lot of effort, so please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing it. Truly helps us a lot. Thanks, and see you again.